Good afternoon. Today is the Zahavi, the 4th day in Taiwan. The program is very easy for you. Intensive. Well, today is a special day in Taiwan or in China. Is the 春分. This means the time, the night, and the day is the same.
The beginning of spring.
The beginning of the. Today afternoon we have the program as follows. At first, Professor Dan Zahavi will present. The topic is the phenomenology and the qualitative research. Maybe 50 minutes. Then we will take a break. Then special Professor Li Weilun from Hualien. He is professor at the Department of Counseling and Clinical Psychology. and some students and another professor are with him together from Hualien to Taipei. Then about 50 minutes, including his response and our discussion and your response. Then we make the second break. Then the second half, second part is our discussion or our question raised to your recent works, especially Self and Other and Husserl's Legacy. So this is a long time, So now welcome to Professor Dan Zahavi.
Thank you so much. So I mean, can everybody hear me if I don't use the mic, or is it a little bit? Is this better?
It's better.
It's better. Does it work at all? Okay. So I'm obviously very pleased to be here, and I'm also very excited to be able to present what I'm going to present right now, because this is very new work of mine, and it's always a bit more exciting to present something new than to present something that one has already spoken of many times. So this is it's a project that I started about half a year ago, and it's basically connected to my recent employment at the University of Oxford, where I was hired to do research that could hopefully somehow have an impact outside of academia. And so thinking about, well, what kind of research could I possibly do that might have an impact and have an impact to non-philosophers, I thought, well, let me take a look at how phenomenology has been used by qualitative researchers, and perhaps I can add or modify or give input to that specific discussion that could potentially also be helpful to non-philosophers interested in phenomenology. So the only thing I want to say before starting is that it might be that the issues I'm going to discuss will perhaps require a little bit of prior knowledge. So if you're completely blank vis-a-vis some of the discussions that has been going on in qualitative research, well, there will be a lot of new stuff for you to learn. Hopefully I won't lose you on the way, and I'll certainly try to do it as pedagogical as possible. Okay, so the basic questions is, that phenomenology has been used, there's been an interest in phenomenology within qualitative research, and the obvious question is whether this really makes sense. Is it possible to use phenomenology, which is at its heart a philosophical discipline, is it possible to use that outside of philosophy? And regardless of whether, even if it is possible, that still doesn't answer the question of whether it's worthwhile. Is it really going to really make an important difference? And even if one says yes to both of these questions. There's also a question of, well, how are we going to do it? How are we going to use phenomenology in a non-philosophical context? And if you kind of look at the discussion, it turns out that there are quite different answers to these questions. And even among those who think that it's possible and that it's worthwhile, there are quite some disagreement about what the best way is to actually apply phenomenology. So what I want to do is to present some aspects of this ongoing debate. I'll criticize some of the prevailing options, and I'll make some suggestions of my own. Okay, so very generally speaking, one might say that if you're doing qualitative research and if you're interested in phenomenology, typically you're also interested in kind of attending to and describing subjective experiences. So let's just assume that that for instance you're interested in cerebral palsy. Then if you are doing qualitative research from a phenomenological point of view, you're not interested in the kind of brain damage that might be responsible for the cerebral palsy. Rather, you're interested in, how does living with this condition, how does that affect the person's experiential life? How does it affect his or her being in the world? So you are interested in, obviously, in the first person perspective. More generally speaking, one can say that qualitative research, I guess probably quite generally, but also especially if it's kind of trying to adopt a phenomenological point of view, basically has the view that human experience itself is a topic worthy of extensive exploration. And there is this idea that the claims by the people you're interviewing, or your clients or your patients, have to be taken seriously. But all of that is very generic, and it still doesn't really answer the question of, well, how are we going to use phenomenology, because probably many qualitative researchers would agree with all of that, even without kind of committing themselves to a specific phenomenological point of view. So there has to be something more, presumably. And let's take a look at the three kind of very influential figures in this debate who all kind of claim to be doing phenomenological qualitative research. And so the three people that I want to focus on is Jonathan Smith, who is was being promoted what is called interpretive phenomenological analysis. There's Max van Manen, who speaks about hermeneutic phenomenology. And then there's Amedeo Giorgi, who talks about or has been developing what he calls descriptive phenomenological method for many years. And these three theorists are quite widely used in a lot of different non-philosophical disciplines, including applied psychology, nursing studies, and educational research, to just mention a few of the areas. And I mean, again, these are people who are quoted quite extensively. So Van Manen's early book from 1990 called Investigating Lived Experience has been quoted 19,000 times. I mean, so we're really talking about people who has had quite an influence. Now, not surprisingly, these three people don't agree about the right way to do and use phenomenology. And so some of the, to just highlight some of the controversies, one of the controversies is this question of whether one should remain purely descriptive or whether it's permissible to use some kind of interpretation if one wants to do phenomenology. And of course, I mean, for anybody with a familiarity with phenomenological philosophy will know that I mean, supposedly this is also a debate that can be found within philosophy between a more descriptive kind of phenomenology and a more hermeneutical kind of phenomenology. There's also another question that is being discussed, which is the question of whether a phenomenologist has to focus on and try to grasp the essences of specific phenomena, or whether one should rather focus on the particularity of the person one is investigating. And there's also, I mean, I'm sure one could find many other issues of controversy, but one important controversy also concerns the question of whether one who wants to do applied phenomenology, one who wants to use phenomenology in qualitative research, whether he should adhere to some of Husserl's methodological recommendations, in particularly, and this is something I will be discussing quite extensively in what follows, in particular the question of whether one has to employ the epoché and the reduction. So that's a very fundamental debate within qualitative research. Okay, let me try quickly to run through the different figures, and I'll spend most time on Giorgi, and you'll see why shortly. But let's start with Jonathan Smith. So his interpretive phenomenological analysis, it's often called IPA, is probably the most widespread of them all. I mean, so he's extremely popular, and the two other figures will claim that there's a very specific reason why he's so popular. And that's because his method is very, very easy. And of course, they will claim the reason why it's so easy is because it has absolutely nothing to do with phenomenology. But I mean, let's see where that goes. In any case, I mean, he initially, in some of his first publications, he was claiming that he wanted to call this method phenomenological because it was interested in capturing, you know, the participant's view. It was interested in somehow the first-person perspective. Smith is also having this ideographic focus, so he's interested not in essential structures, not in general descriptions. He's interested in very detailed investigations of very specific cases. And so, you know, to just mention some of the cases he has been investigated himself, you know, how does George experience being homeless? How does Anna experience being a mother? So that's what the focus is about. It's not about what is homelessness as such or what is motherhood as such. No, it's about what does this or that person experience. So Smith is not particularly interested in Husserlian phenomenology. He's kind of drawing, or not drawing, again depends on how one views what he's doing, but I mean there's no specific Husserlian focus in his method. And one way that shows up is that he doesn't talk about the epoché, he doesn't talk about the reduction, he doesn't say that it's necessary only to do description, and of course this comes out in the very, the very label for his approach, interpretative. So of course he wants to claim that interpretation is something that is permissible. Indeed, he wants to say that any human beings aren't necessarily always engaged in some kind of interpretive meaning making, and so I mean, it's unavoidable to use interpretation. Now, in one of his recent, a very recent article where he was replying to some criticism coming from Max van Manen, Jonathan Smith argues, he basically writes that according to IPA, the primary role of the researcher is to invite the participant to share an episode of sense-making, to act as a witness to its articulation, and in turn to make sense of it. And then Smith says that because this process is a central feature of IPA, it means that it's aligning with Heidegger's hermeneutic phenomenology, which I think is a bit crazy. I mean, because surely this doesn't make you Heideggerian. I mean, to insist on doing that. But this is what Smith is claiming. Now, so I mean, one obvious question, of course, to already kind of start the criticism is, okay, Smith wants to say that it's important to highlight the first-person perspective, but the obvious question is that sufficient? I mean, if we are interested, I mean, is the very fact that we are trying to get to and show, is the fact that we are showing interest in the subject's perspective, is that enough to make the method phenomenological, or do we need something more? And if that is all, well, how does it then differ from all kinds of other qualitative approaches? Now again, Smith has said, well, this is a phenomenological approach, and it's phenomenological because it, as he says, tries to examine experience according to its own terms rather than according to predefined category systems. Again, one could say, but is there not more to phenomenology than that? And when being confronted with that criticism, Smith has said, well, might be that the philosophers come here and say that there is more to phenomenology than this, but philosophers do not own phenomenology. So he's basically saying, okay, you might work yourself up here, but why should I care? You don't have monopoly. You're not entitled to monopolize, what we mean by phenomenology. He also claims that the philosophers, what they have actually been doing is just to formalize something all of us were doing already, which also strikes me as a somewhat trivializing description of what Husserl and Heidegger and Manen have been doing. Now, as I said, philosophers might criticize Smith, but so there's certainly also some of the others who have criticized Smith. And one very ardent critic is van Manen, who in a number of publications in qualitative health research, the journal Qualitative Health Research, in 2017 and 2018, so very recently, have argued that Smith has hijacked the term phenomenology. He's just using it in order to gain more readers. It has nothing to do with phenomenology, actually. He's also saying that Smith's methodology is hopelessly misrepresentative of phenomenology in any acceptable sense, kind of pretty dramatic criticism, and that the program of IPAs is far too shallow and superficial to qualify as phenomenological in the original sense of the term. So basically, Manen's proposal is that IPA, interpretive phenomenological analysis, really had, that the best thing to do would be to redefine it as interpretive psychological analysis, and then nobody would object to it. Okay, so this was a little bit about Jonathan Smith. What about Max van Manen then, who, as you have just seen, is very insistent on defending phenomenology in its original sense. And so van Manen keeps insisting that phenomenology is a philosophical project, and we need to return to the origin and kind of consult primary texts, primary literature, with the classical figures if you want to use phenomenology within qualitative research. He's also insisting, a bit like Smith, on the permissibility of using interpretation. And then he says, and this is something he says repeatedly, that the aim of phenomenology is to study the lived meaning of experience. He also repeatedly says that the basic phenomenological question is the question of what is this experience like. Then he argues, and again here we have a difference to Smith. He claims that you can't really do phenomenological qualitative research unless you use the basic methods of phenomenology, and the basic methods is the epoché and the reduction. What is the aim of the epoché and the reduction? Well, the aim of them, and the reason why philosophers have used it, is because that will allow philosophers to grasp the phenomenological meaning of a human experience. So again, there's this insistence on phenomenology being focused on the meaning of experience. And he also says, and again, for those of you who are familiar with phenomenology, you should start getting a little bit worried now, because he also says, this is a direct quote, phenomenology is the study of the phenomena, and the phenomena are someone's experiences. Is that really true? Is that the only thing that phenomenology is investigating? People's experiences? How does that kind of address the fact that phenomenology typically has been interested in intentionality? Intentionality is not just about experience, it's also about what is being experienced. And part of the phenomenological project is to describe what is being experienced precisely as this is given, which is something different from the experience of it. But it's just kind of completely lost in the way van Manen talks about phenomenology. Now, his Phenomenology of Practice, which is a more recent book from 2014, has been praised as offering a substantial clarification of the central phenomenological concepts and as a particularly enlightening treatment of what it actually means to do phenomenological research. So I mean, this recent book, which is a very long book, I think 450 pages or so, is probably the most extensive, lengthy treatment of phenomenology as a qualitative method. So what do we find there? Well, initially, Van Manen says that it's really important to be able to present the phenomenological project and the phenomenological method in a way that is not overly technical, because only if you can do that will it be possible to actually teach it to non-philosophers. So it's very important again to present, the basic ideas in as non-technical a method. Now, is that what he's doing? Well, Van Manen doesn't just talk about the epoché and the reduction. If we look at the chapter that deals with philosophical methods, Van Manen claims that the beginning stage of the epoché contains 5 distinct components: the heuristic reduction, the hermeneutic reduction, the experiential reduction, and the methodological reduction. But this is only the beginning, because then there is the full-scaled reduction, which includes also the eidetic reduction, the ontological reduction, the ethical reduction, the radical reduction, and the originary reduction. So now we have 9 different reductions that we somehow need to keep track on if we want to do qualitative research that is based on, I don't know, the origin of phenomenology. But unfortunately, Van Manen doesn't stop here, because he also talks about the difference between the revocative, evocative, invocative, convocative, and provocative method. And if that is not the end of it, he also talks about the distinction between the reduction, the deduction, the induction, the production, the production, the abduction, and the seduction. I mean, as you can probably anticipate, I mean, I find this completely ludicrous. I mean, we have now so many different notions, and I mean, if you're looking at literature written by non-philosophers about phenomenology, I'll give some examples later on, it's very, very rare to find contributions that can actually adequately describe the difference between the epoché and the reduction. Now, given the difficulties involved in just making that distinction, I mean, how is this supposed to be usable for anybody? I'd be really, really interested if there's actually somebody present who might convince me otherwise. Perhaps it's just me, but I mean, again, I mean, to be a little bit malicious, I mean, I really think that what is important here is the notion of seduction, because I think Van Manen has been seduced by language, and I also think that anybody who thinks that this is a very clear and accessible presentation of phenomenology has been seduced by Van Manen. Anyway, so that's one problem, but I also think there are some theoretical problems here, because anybody, I mean, there come 2 main problems. The first problem is that if you go back to the classical texts, I mean, they do not contain these notions. I don't know where they're coming from. I mean, these are Van Manen's own inventions. I mean, Husserl never distinguishes these 4 initial stages of the reduction, neither does Heidegger. So one problem is that many of these notions are fabrications. Another problem is that even if it might be possible to locate some of these concepts in different authors. So let's just assume perhaps the ethical reduction, perhaps it's possible to align that with Levinas. Perhaps the ontological reduction, perhaps that's Heidegger. It's kind of strange, incidental. He doesn't mention the transcendental reduction. The most important reduction of them all is somehow left out. I don't know why, but let's just say that the eidetic reduction is Husserl. So even if we could kind of trace some of these different notions to specific authors, what is the justification for claiming that it can all be presented as one package. I mean, of course, many of the authors in question would argue that their specific take was completely incompatible. I mean, Levinas famously was very critical of ontology. And so I mean, so there are kind of two problems here. One is that there's a lot of self-invented concepts. The other problem is that presenting this as a kind of full package just overlooks the fact that many of the philosophers who come up with the concept actually thought that they were in clear conflict with some of the previous concepts. And then one could say, well, I mean, actually, if Van Manen had managed to pull it off and actually been able to show how all these different concepts are actually compatible, how they present different aspects of a common phenomenological project, I mean, that would have been a major theoretical contribution. I mean, a really outstanding, contribution. But of course, he doesn't do that. There's nowhere in his text where he explains how these different concepts are supposed to interact with one another. Now, if you think that I'm getting a little bit angry, I'll explain to you later on. But there's a specific personal reason for this. But I'll kind of leave that to the Q&A. Oh yeah, no, I need to mention that as well, because I guess I have to say, the thing is, I have criticized him in writing, and he has then replied. So I wrote a fairly short text criticizing both him and Smith, a text of that was 8 pages long, and I kind of anticipated that Van Manen probably would reply. Well, he did. He wrote a 20-page long rebuttal, basically claiming that my own research, even if it was technically sophisticated, was completely irrelevant for anybody outside of philosophy. And he also then introduced this kind of interesting distinction between those who do phenomenology, which is himself, and those who just study phenomenological philosophy. And then he was claiming that the latter, that they fail to kind of face the phenomenon directly. So it's kind of, I mean, so as he says, they are not unwilling to look phenomenology in the face. It's a kind of very convenient way of saying, okay, you might have all these theoretical arguments against me, but that's just because you are kind of a conceptual fetishist. And in fact, I kind of know, the deep core of phenomenology. Okay, then finally, Giorgi. I mean, I think my main reason for spending more time on him is that I think he's much more well-grounded than the two others, but I have a specific problem, nevertheless, with his method as well. So Giorgi is very committed to a Husserlian approach. He's not really interested that much in the other phenomenologists. He's also very interested in description, so that's also why his project is called Descriptive Phenomenological Psychology. And he's particularly being inspired by Husserl's own writings on phenomenological psychology. So he, like Van Manen, claims that you can only apply phenomenology if you have an understanding of its philosophical underpinnings. And he basically says that we have different aims here. We need to offer a description of the essential structures, again in contrast to Jonathan Smith. And he claims that involves 3 elements. In order to give this essential description of lived experience, there are kind of 3 features that needs to be observed. First of all, we need to perform the reduction, and he defines, I think quite correctly, the reduction, the epoché, as resisting from positing as existing any object or state of affairs. So it's about the suspension of our positing. It's kind of trying to bracket the issue of existence. And he claims that only if you do that, you can really focus on what is given rather than just automatically, as we usually are, being absorbed and preoccupied with the objects. So that's one element. The other is, as I already mentioned, the descriptive element. Focus is not interpretive, it's not explanatory. It's really trying to do justice to experience. And finally, there's this focus on essences. Now, as I mentioned, the epoché and reduction is very important for Giorgi. So here's a quote: "Adopting the phenomenological method in the human sciences requires that the researcher brackets or disengage from all past theories of knowledge about the phenomenon and withholds existential assent of the phenomenon." And again, he claims that the researcher has to assume the attitude of phenomenological reduction. Again, if you want to do qualitative research which is based on phenomenology, you have to do the reduction. That means that you resist from positing as existing whatever object the state of affairs is present to her. And then says the researcher still considers what is given to her, but she treats it as something that is present to her consciousness, and she refrains from saying that it actually is the way it presents itself to her. So again, there's this suspension of bracketing of existence. It's merely about describing the phenomena without taking a stance on whether it's real or not. And so again, this is hammered again and again by Giorgi, and I guess this is also one reason why Giorgi is very dissatisfied with Jonathan Smith, that you cannot do any kind of research which is supposed to be phenomenological unless you use the reduction. Now, here's one initial problematization of that claim, because let's go back to Husserl himself, who of course is the philosopher who has been talking about the epoché and the reduction primarily. So why did he introduce these notions? As will be well known, I mean, in logical investigations, Husserl didn't use the notion of epoché and reduction. In the logical investigations, in the first edition, he still described his project as a kind of descriptive psychology. Now, he very quickly came to realize that this was a mistake. What is going on in logical investigations is not psychology, it is philosophy. I mean, the notion of descriptive psychology is, of course, also traced back to Brentano. So calling it that was also, I guess, a way of kind of acknowledging the heritage. But he also came to realize that actually what he was up to was something that, in very fundamental ways, departed from the Brentanian project. And I think that one of the reasons why Husserl started talking about the epoché and the reduction was precisely to highlight the specific philosophical character of his phenomenological project. Now, more specifically, and again, this is basically what you find in Ideas 1, the reason why we need the epoché and the reduction is because philosophy has to engage with these very fundamental epistemological and metaphysical problems. It cannot do so in a sufficiently radical manner if it simply takes the answers for granted. And some of the answers that are often taken for granted concerns precisely the assumption that the world exists independently of us. So this is a very fundamental, kind of realistic assumption that all of us normally make. And for Husserl, we can't just take it for granted that that assumption is correct. Because if we do that, we are not doing philosophy proper. So we need to bracket this natural realist assumption. We need to bracket what Husserl calls the natural attitude. We need to bracket and suspend our automatic belief in the mind-independent existence of the world. And so by doing that, and by liberating us from what he considers to be kind of natural dogmatism, it will be possible gradually to uncover what Husserl takes to be the transcendental or constitutive significance of consciousness. So I think that's really what is at stake here, and that's why Husserl says that if we do that, I mean, we will eventually be able to really supply an answer to the most fundamental question, namely the question of the obviousness of the being of the world. I mean, that is for him, you know, the big puzzle. How is it that the world can appear for us as something just obviously existing? He wants to clarify the possible conditions and possibility for that. I just want to highlight quickly vis-a-vis Van Manen. I mean, here Husserl says that this, the greatest of all enigmas for phenomenology is this question: but I mean, the question about the obviousness of the being of the world strikes me as a somewhat different question than the meaning of lived experience. I mean, just to highlight that it doesn't seem as if we're just talking about the same things here. And then, of course, the obvious question is, well, if this is what the epoché and the reduction is supposed to accomplish, it's supposed to offer us the possibility of answering very fundamental philosophical questions. If that's the purpose, well, what sense does it then make to say that a nurse who wants to provide better health care for a patient who is suffering from, I don't know, a recent amputee, that she needs to effectuate the epoché and the reduction? Why should that make any sense? What if you are an educator or a physiotherapist, or why do you need to perform certain steps, the aim of which is basically to engage with the classical realism, idealism question? I mean, why should that be necessary? As I mentioned a moment ago, Giorgi actually claims to be relying on Husserl's own work here, namely Husserl's work on phenomenological psychology. And so I just need to spend a little bit of time on some technicalities, and then I kind of move towards a quick conclusion. Because if we go back to Husserl's own work, I mean, might Husserl himself suggest, might there be places where Husserl himself is suggesting that if you want to do proper psychology, you need to do the epoché? So in these lectures from the mid-20s, or in a number of writings from the mid-20s, Husserl is saying that phenomenology can provide psychology with a solid foundation. Why is that the case? Well, the moment you realize that psychology isn't just about behavior, it's about consciousness, then it's perhaps not so surprising to claim that perhaps phenomenology has something to offer. I mean, something very fundamental to offer the scientific investigation of consciousness. And then Husserl proceeds by saying that a really rigorous psychology, I mean, insofar as it's preoccupied with consciousness, the first step for scientific psychology is to obtain detailed descriptions of consciousness. And in order to obtain those descriptions, Husserl claims that that the psychologist has to employ a special method, namely the phenomenological psychological reduction. So this is not the transcendental phenomenological reduction, it's a kind of a different reduction, but he still talks about the reduction as something that is being used or has to be used by the psychologist. He also talks about how one can only attain one's subject matter as a psychologist if one employs a universal epoché of validity. So he talks about the need for the epoché, Geltungs epoché. And so one might say, well, I mean, this is what you find in Husserl's own text. So presumably that just proves Giorgi to be right. That's the end of story. And then I guess one could go two ways. Either one could say, okay, Husserl said it, but he was wrong, and then we'll move on. But I just want to tell you that actually the story is a little bit more complicated than I think Giorgi is making it out to be. Because if we look more closely at what Husserl is saying in those texts, I think he's actually pursuing two different arguments which point in very different directions. The first argument is that any science whatsoever, in order to be able to do what it's out to do, it has to effectuate a certain epoché. This goes for physics, botanics, astronomy, so it's not just psychology. Any science has to effectuate a certain epoché. He also talks about how it involves a certain reduction. He says that any science have to engage in a kind of abstraktive Einstellungsänderung, a kind of abstractive narrowing of focus. And I mean, it's not hard to understand what is going on here. I mean, the point is simply, well, if you are interested in physiology, well then if you want to investigate a living human body, well then you have to abstract from, I mean, the kind of psychological aspects of that body, because that's not what you are interested in. You're interested in the physiological parts. Or if you want to do mathematics, I mean, then you abstract from certain other things which will just distract you from your focus. So it seems as if Husserl is saying, well, you know, the epoché reduction here is really used in a very different sense compared to how he's using it when he's talking about philosophy. It's really just talking about a kind of a narrowing of focus. And that's not how he's talking about the philosophical epoché and the reduction. I mean, some of you will know the famous place in Crisis, where Husserl talks about the transition from a two-dimensional life to a three-dimensional life the moment you perform the epoché and the reduction. The epoché and reduction is about expanding our focus. It's about making us, you know, attentive to something that we didn't previously realize. It's not about narrowing our focus, it's about expanding the focus. So the epoché and reduction in philosophy is very different from how it's being used in these texts. And of course also, but I think this is admitted by Giorgi, in philosophy the epoché and reduction is supposed to bracket the natural attitude. When we are talking about the epoché and the reduction in psychology or physics, it's also supposed to take place within the natural attitude. So there's also a huge difference between the two. And that's, of course, is also why he claims that the phenomenological psychological epoché is uneigentlich, unecht, it's inauthentic, it's not the real kind. So ultimately, I mean, the question is whether so it is true that Husserl talks about the epoché and the reduction, but it just doesn't have anything to do with the notions as we usually understand them. So that's kind of one line of argument. But then there's a second line of argument where Husserl says that the psychological reduction is just the first step. This is actually an idea he also develops in Crisis. Psychological reduction is the first step, and it has to be completed by a transcendental reduction. So here's a quote from Crisis. Thus we see with surprise, I think, that in the pure development of the idea of a descriptive psychology, which seeks to bring to expression what is essentially proper to souls, there necessarily occurs a transformation of the phenomenological psychological epoché and reduction into the transcendental. So I think what Husserl is up to here, and he actually even claims that there is no such thing as a pure non-transcendental psychology. Pure psychology is identical with transcendental philosophy. So I think what Husserl is saying here is basically something like the following. If you really start paying attention to consciousness, you cannot remain within the natural attitude. You cannot treat consciousness simply as yet another object in the world. If you really investigate consciousness profoundly, you will be dragged towards a more transcendental philosophical perspective on consciousness. Now, the problem is the following. So these are, I think, the two, and again, these are two very different arguments, and they're kind of intertwined and intermixed in these writings. But there's a problem, I think, for Giorgi, regardless of whether you go one direction or the other direction. Because what is it he claims? Well, he claims that the epoché and the reduction are essential from logical psychology, understood as a distinct non-transcendental human science. And this is his main argument. The problem is that, according to the first reading of Husserl, there's really nothing, I mean, what Husserl means by phenomenological psychology, what he means by phenomenological epoché and reduction really has nothing to do with the philosophical epoché and reduction. It's really something different, and I mean, it's not, and again, as I said, psychology is not unique. Any other science would also have to do a certain epoché and reduction. So to somehow claim that if you want to be a psychologist, you have to undertake some very specific, kind of slightly esoteric steps, I mean, it's not what Husserl is saying. The other reading is, well, they actually have quite a lot in common. The psychological epoché and reduction is very akin to the philosophical epoché and the reduction. The problem is just that if you can't go down that route, well, then you are giving up on the independence of phenomenological psychology, because Husserl is saying there is no pure, non-transcendental psychology. I mean, if you really go down that way, well, then you will end in transcendental philosophy, and there's no kind of autonomy to be given. Okay, so much for Giorgi. So let me just finally present one additional possible take that I think is actually kind of quite widespread among many of the other figures that I haven't mentioned. Because it could be that one would say, okay, let's forget about Husserl's writing on phenomenological psychology. I mean, perhaps he has some kind of complicated, argument going on there. So let's not base our approach on that. Let's rather just go back to the early Husserl. Let's go back to the early Husserl of logical investigations. And the claim could then be, if we do the epoché, we need the epoché in order to make consciousness into a proper theme of investigation. This is basically a quote. If you want to investigate the how of experience rather than the what of experience, we need to perform the epoché. And the claim could also be that it's precisely by performing the epoché that we bracket and suspend various theoretical presuppositions and prejudices, which allows us to turn to the things themselves. So now the claim is a bit different. The claim is, well, some of Husserl's early slogans was, back to the things themselves. Let's have an unprejudiced description. Let's try to focus on consciousness as well. Perhaps that's what the epoché and reduction is needed for. The problem is just that this is not based on a proper reading of the texts. Why not? Well, because in logical investigations, this is where he offered descriptive phenomenology. This is where Husserl made the slogan about the need for returning to the things themselves. In logical investigations, there is absolutely no reference to the epoché and the reduction. So to claim that we need to do that in order to do what Husserl was doing in logical investigations just doesn't really make sense, because Husserl himself didn't think it was necessary. I can also point to a lecture that is probably not so well known to you. So Adolf Reinhardt was one of Husserl's most promising young followers, a very kind of independent figure of his own right. He died very young because he was killed in the First World War. He gave a talk in 1914 called What is Phenomenology, where he discusses the phenomenological attitude, he discusses the need for return to the things themselves. He emphasized the importance of offering fine-grained descriptions of experience, and he also insists on the importance of turning to the essences. So I mean, all of these things presumably are something that phenomenological psychologists would like. I mean, he kind of emphasizing all of it. The problem again is there's absolutely no reference to the epoché and reduction in Reinhardt's presentation of phenomenology. He doesn't mention it at all. Now why not? Well, I'll give you a very simple answer. Reinhardt was a realist phenomenologist, so he was not interested in Husserl's transcendental turn. He saw that it was a mistake, and so for that reason there was no reason for him to engage in the epoché and the reduction, because the epoché and the reduction are precisely necessary ingredients in transcendental phenomenology. And so, which then again leaves us with the question, well, why do we need to do that if we want to use phenomenology in a non-philosophical context within qualitative research? So not only do I think it's theoretically unjustified, but I also have to say that I find this constant emphasis by many of these theorists on the importance of using the epoché and the reduction. I mean, I think it has generated an immense amount of confusion. Because as I said a while ago, I mean, it's one thing that Van Manen operates with all his distinctions, but if you just focus on the epoché and the reduction, it's actually quite hard to find that properly described in texts by non-philosophers. And let me just give you a couple of examples. This is actually a philosopher. He's an analytic philosopher who for many years have been extremely hostile against phenomenology as a qualitative research method. Now I don't accept his own proposal. I think he's biased, and again he's very, very hostile, and he makes a lot of confusions himself. But I can kind of see why he's so aggravated when reading some of the presentations of phenomenology, that some of the figures that I've just been presenting are kind of, spreading around. And so here's his description of what the phenomenological reduction is. He claims that Husserl tried to break out of experience into the realm of pure consciousness through the phenomenological reduction. I have no idea what that's supposed to mean. What does it mean to break out of experience into consciousness? Well, that's his attempt of explaining the reduction. Langridge writes that when Husserl did the reduction, he sought to take a God's eye view on experience. This is also a kind of very untraditional way of reading the reduction. It has absolutely no basis in any of Husserl's writings. Godet and Robert, this is a text from last year, they have argued that Husserl's aim was to adopt a point of view from nowhere and erase his own presence from the analytic work, for which reason his pursuit is similar to that of the positivists. Okay, where did that come from? I mean, it's all complete bullshit. I mean, sorry for using the term. But why is it the case? Well, because they all think it's necessary to somehow engage with the epoché and the reduction if you want to present phenomenology as a qualitative research method. And I say I don't only think it's theoretically unjustified, but it has just generated so much nonsense. So to kind of summarize the findings, I think there are kind of three dangers in much of the existing research. I mean, some of it is just too superficial. I mean, here I primarily have Jonathan Smith in mind. Some of it is too philosophical, I guess. Perhaps one could claim this is the case with Manen. I mean, many of those technical concepts are just completely unclear. And then there are also, and this I think would be Giorgi, there's this misplaced methodological requirement about, saying that you have to perform the reduction if you want to claim phenomenological status for the kind of work you're doing. Now, so here's the very, very short final conclusion. So now we spend a lot of time criticizing, what is my own kind of alternative? And I think I only have 2 slides left, so don't get your hopes high here. It's going to be very brief. This is basically the argument I've been making during the last 6 months, so I'm already kind of publishing on this. Why ignore the way in which phenomenology has been used in other disciplines? I mean, because many of the qualitative researchers, they don't really pay, for whatever reason, they don't pay attention to the way in which phenomenology has been applied in other non-philosophical disciplines that are not qualitative. And perhaps one could learn from some of the ways phenomenology has been used in those disciplines. And I think, a couple of examples, you can both go back in history to some of the classical phenomenological psychologists. There's a very long tradition in phenomenological psychiatry. And then there's also what is called naturalized phenomenology, which is this project that has been going on for the last 25 years, trying to fuse phenomenology and cognitive science. So perhaps there are ways one can learn from those efforts that might perhaps provide better footing for using phenomenology within qualitative research. And let me just point to 2 different, possible areas where one might learn something from the existing resources. One concerns data gathering. How do we collect the data in the first place, and how do we interpret them? Now, when it comes to the data gathering, it's obvious. The phenomenological interview has to be of paramount importance, because if you're interested in the subjective first-person reports of your client or patient or interviewee, and you need to speak with them, so you need to ask questions, presumably. And one question would be, well, how much has Giorgi, for instance, who has been pushing this notion of descriptive phenomenological psychology for so many years, how much has he had to say about phenomenological interview? Well, surprisingly little, because his main contribution concerns what you're supposed to do with the data after you have gotten them. And I mean, that might be important as well, but I mean, it seems kind of strange that you don't also give instructions about how the data are supposed to be obtained in the first place. Now, he's not saying that, but you can find people who are saying that if you want to do a phenomenological interview, you're basically not allowed to ask any questions, or at most 1 or 2 questions. Because if you ask more questions, I mean, then you are guiding or imposing your own kind of perspective on the person you are interviewing. But the problem is just this doesn't work. I mean, it's a bit like saying, as an interviewer, I'm basically a microphone. I mean, I put it down the table and say something interesting, and then I'll analyze it subsequently. And I mean, had we all been master phenomenologists, I mean, then perhaps this method would work, but of course that's unfortunately not the situation. I mean, what if the patients who are being interviewed don't really know what to say, or they only offer very superficial descriptions or very short descriptions? What then? I mean, is that then the end of the data gathering? And I think that here one can actually find some very different suggestions if one goes, I mean, within qualitative research, there's surely also a lot of people who have been working on far more sophisticated types of interview techniques. But perhaps especially among non-phenomenological forms of qualitative research. And I guess what I want to say is that among people working in psychiatry and cognitive science who explicitly define themselves as adopting a phenomenological perspective, you can actually find quite a lot of resources on how to conduct interviews. So let me here just point to one single case, which is one I've been involved in myself. So there's a group of psychiatrists who about 10 years ago compiled something called EASE, Examination of Anomalous Self-Experiences, which is a very long list of different items that one can ask questions about, items pertaining to the self, no self-distinction, to embodiment, to spatiality, to temporality, etc. So it was a checklist or an interview guide very much based in phenomenological philosophy, and it was supposed to support a very systematic clinical exploration of the patient's experiential life. Now, using this checklist, what people then do when they do EASE interviews is that they do semi-structured interviews. So there's a kind of a lot of questions. I mean, so it's not about just asking, it's not a structured interview where you just ask a specific series of questions and then the person can say yes or no or something like that. It's a much more open-ended interview process, but there are specific areas that kind of needs to be covered, and if the patient doesn't answer in a very informative way, I mean, then you can try different other ways to ask kind of follow-up questions to try to see if you can get more information out of the patient. And so by doing that, I mean, they can really target a lot of different dimensions that phenomenological philosophers have traditionally argued are very fundamental to our being in the world. So again, embodiment, sociality, temporality, spatiality, and so on. And so importantly, I mean, what we find here is that the way these psychiatrists have been using phenomenology is not just about showing interest in the first-person perspective of the interviewed patient. No, it's about using it's really about using a very specific theoretical framework. So again, I mean, it's a very different way of looking at it. It's not about suspending all your prior knowledge and not asking any questions. No, using phenomenology for these people is about asking a lot of very specific questions on the basis of a very extensive theoretical framework. And I mean, there is a classic within phenomenological psychiatry. Eugene Minkowski is one of the classical psychiatrists working with phenomenology. He was very active in the 20s and 30s. In his book Lived Time, he basically argues that insight from phenomenology is kind of very important for clinical practice, for psychopathology, for our ability to really understand, the changed and transformed life world of the patient. He argues that phenomenology kind of gives us tools that can allow us a much better understanding of the patient. But interestingly, already then he was actually proposing something that has become something of a catchword, 70 years later, because he didn't only propose that phenomenological philosophy could be of value for the psychiatrist. He was also proposing that the influence could go in the opposite direction, and he was saying that some of the very abstract phenomenological, some of the very abstract philosophical notions could become much more concrete, much more tangible as a result of actually, being used in this exploration of the patient's experiential life, and that it might also be possible to refine and make the descriptions more sophisticated by precisely attending to kind of unusual experiences. So again, it was a kind of forth and back, or kind of mutual enlightenment, or two-way street. And then, and I think this is really interesting, and I say again, kind of, I think, speaking against Van Manen. So at one point, Minkowski writes as follows: "It was never a question of transposing purely and simply the data and methods used by a given philosopher into the realm of psychopathological facts. That would have led inevitably to a hyper-philosophizing of psychopathology, a danger I carefully avoided and against which I warned my young colleagues who were following in my path. It would have risked deforming psychopathology entirely." So again, what is he warning against? Well, he's also warning against just, adopting, 200 different technical concepts and then, basically implementing them on the concrete case, because, this is not beneficial for clinical practice, and that's obviously what he's saying here. So this is the final slide. So what am I proposing? Well, I think that if you want to do, I would suggest that if you're interested in phenomenology, and if you're working as a qualitative researcher, perhaps you should start to look a bit beyond the three figures I have mentioned. There are other resources that can be of inspiration and that it might be fruitful for you to engage with, including classical phenomenological psychology, the very long tradition of phenomenological psychiatry, but also all the recent discussions of the interface between cognitive science and phenomenology. As I've already said, I don't think, applying phenomenology is not just about being interested in the first person perspective. It's also about, it's about employing a very comprehensive theoretical framework. And I think that there are other elements of philosophical phenomenology that are far more relevant to the qualitative researcher than the notions of the epoché and the reduction. Consider, for instance, the phenomenologist's criticism of scientism, or his insistence on the importance of the life world. Think about, this is the early Husserl also in logical investigation. The importance of developing an open-minded and non-biased attitude. And again, let me just emphasize, doing that and employing the epoché and the reduction is not the same, because as I've said before, you can easily argue, you can argue that it's important to let the phenomena speak and not to arrive at all kinds of theoretical prejudices. You can defend that view without having any interest in the idealism-realism debate, which I ultimately think is what the epoché and the reduction is concerned with. Also think of what phenomenology can offer, when it comes to this, comprehensive conception of what it means to be a human being. Think of how notions like empathy, or life world, or embodiment, the pre-reflective experience can be used in a lot of different, practical contexts, in order to understand, the situation of the person you are interviewing. And so I think that what is really important here is that whatever concepts are being taken over and used, they should show their relevance. That's the only justification for adopting them. So I guess that could be seen as a very kind of pragmatic attitude. If you want to use philosophy, in your research, it has to be because it allows you to do something you wouldn't be able to do otherwise. It has to be something, and not just that, but it also has to be better than other kind of possibilities. I mean, that's the only concern you ought to have. You certainly shouldn't be, concerned with being orthodox. You shouldn't be concerned with doing what Husserl and Heidegger were doing, because that's just a misplaced kind of concern. So, thank you very much.
Yeah, very thanks, Zahavi's presentation. For me, maybe you have presented in 4 parts. The first part is critique on the 3 phenomenologies or the applied phenomenology. Second part is you want to highlight the eigenaged epoché and the reduction. And the third part is we should go back to classic phenomenology, applied phenomenologies, and so on. Then for the fourth part is the recommendation, with another way to approach the applied phenomenology. Very thanks. So we make a break. I think just 10 minutes is enough. Then come back. Thank you.
Okay.
Now, Professor Li begin to respond to Zahavi's presentation. Okay.
Okay. First, I would thank Dr. Zahavi for being here and sharing your point of view on qualitative research, and also I would thank to Dr. Wang having me here. And I'm Li维伦. I come from National東華 University, the Department of Counseling and Clinical Psychology. And I think I'm sort of here represent the voice from the different side, okay? Because after I go back from Duquesne University in Pittsburgh in year 1999, I have engaged in this approach, the phenomenological approach toward qualitative research. So, I'm familiar with Giorgi's method. I know a little bit about Manen's, and I'm not really like IPA. So, anyway, and I will, because today I have read Dr. Zahavi's recent writings regarding this matter. So I have prepared a short presentation, and maybe later I will respond to what Dr. Zahavi said today. Okay, and this is some of my articles concerning the methodology, phenomenological methodology. Okay, and also because I'm engaged in the movement of indigenous psychology, so I think phenomenology can be a method, a choice for indigenous psychology. And so I think some of you will have the article series breaking into face-to-face encounter, and this one in Chinese talk about a modified version of Giorgi's method. Okay, so I'll begin. The empirical researchers who engage themselves in phenomenological approach are those who do not satisfied with the mainstream scientism and seek for alternatives to have a better understanding of the target phenomena in order to advance their goal of helping people, taking the helping operations as example. Recently, Zahavi raised the issue that phenomenologically informed qualitative research has different aims than phenomenological philosophy, but it is questionable whether the former can qualify as phenomenological if it either ignores or misinterprets the latter. Indeed, since phenomenology is originally a philosophical school, one may wonder what is that which makes an empirical qualitative research to be claimed as phenomenological. Speaking differently, the question is how the method used and the result presented in the qualitative research can qualify as phenomenological if it is claimed to be so. One may tend to think that getting familiar with the philosophical works in phenomenology is basic and necessary. I agree with that. Getting familiar with the original thinker's work in phenomenology is very helpful for conducting phenomenological qualitative research. But knowing phenomenology, however, does not equal to doing phenomenology. Besides, the familiarity alone is not enough for handling empirical data and the various aspects of empirical research properly. The key then is not just getting familiar with philosophical phenomenology, but how to conduct empirical phenomenological research in accordance with philosophical phenomenology in a distinctive sense. In the field of philosophy, phenomenology, however, has been recognized as an umbrella term covering the thoughts of Husserl, Heidegger, Merleau-Ponty, Sartre, and so on. While there must be identifiable common characteristics of these thinkers that bring them together under the term of phenomenology, their thoughts, nonetheless, sometimes appear not just incoherent, but even contradictory to each other. What is then that of philosophical phenomenology which philosophical qualitative research has to be in accordance with? How can this accordance be properly achieved? To this question, Zahavi, maybe somehow a little bit simplified, but anyway, we can discuss later, suggests that one empirical qualitative research can be qualified as a phenomenological one if it employs notions such as the life world, the lived bodies, spatiality, temporality to elucidate the empirical data. It seems that the use of phenomenological notion derived from philosophical phenomenology are the criterion for an empirical research to be phenomenological. Surprisingly, besides this what to do, Zahavi also suggested a thing not to do, that there is no need for empirical qualitative researchers to perform epoché and phenomenological reduction in their studies. Zahavi's suggestion, both the things to do and the thing not to do, remind me of a debate within the circle of empirical phenomenological researchers. Actually, that's happened before. Okay, I think it's going on right now. The debate stems from the hesitation toward Brechting or epoché and phenomenological reduction. The debate is about how to incorporate ontological phenomenological understandings about human existence into the operation of phenomenological method, since the core of the latter is Brechting, that is, the suspension of presuppositions, which may include any ontological understanding. While some scholars insist on the rigorous and the durability of Brechting, epoché, and the phenomenological reduction, others also point out the inevitability of presuming the ontological status of the life world and the necessity to employ ontological phenomenological understanding such as spatiality, temporality, and embodiment. Correspondingly, as the notion of life world is welcomed by the researchers in empirical phenomenological studies, most of them hold the view that Husserl's transcendental reduction is impossible and incompatible with their interest in mundane experience. As a result, most of the empirical researchers in phenomenological approach are inclined to a modified version of partial reduction, which aims at Brechting or Bredel as Dauber proposed, our presumptions in order to achieve a kind of openness to the life world. It is partial. I call it partial because it still holds the impossibility in suspending the presumption of the life world. In other words, some presumptions are seen as breakage to our openness, and the life world is the presumed goal for investigation. For these researchers, the purpose of performing the phenomenological reduction is to avoid bridges and enter the life world. This is my way of seeing it. Okay. As a clinical psychologists and empirical researchers in phenomenological approach, I'm on the same page with those who are concerned with human experience in worldly context. However, I also agree with Husserl's worry about the vicious circle of tautology. If we hold the essential conditions as unbreakable, how can we know they are not only perspectives, but in dissentable essence? It is clear that Husserl will not accept this modification and insist on securing the ground of knowledge. As I disagree with both the idea of partial reduction and the function of reduction as avoiding prejudice, I'm also hesitate to agree with Zahavi's suggestions for the things to do and the things not to do regarding what a phenomenological empirical research should be. I will address my view corresponding to Zahavi's suggestions in terms of the following topics: the problem of employing the notion of life role within the natural attitude, the necessity of bracketing, epoché, and phenomenological reduction, and what can be achieved with a phenomenological informed interview method, as Dr. Zahavi just suggests. Okay, so the first is the problem. Even one believes those essential conditions such as life role, embodiment, and so on are indispensable facets of human existence. Does this guarantee one's understanding of life role? For example, being proper to the life role proposed by Husserl? Is it possible that one take the notion of life role as the world of natural attitude? How can we help someone to differentiate the notion of life role from the world of natural attitude? Can we do it without appealing to phenomenological reduction? In addition to the danger of trapping in the natural attitude, the meaning of life role could not be properly grasped if one failed to understand the phenomenological reduction. According to Husserl, the life role as pre-given can be accessible only through a total change of the natural attitude. That is, the life role is not about actual beings, but about the constituting process of beings revealed after the transcendental phenomenological reduction. The life role is thus transcendental. Okay. On the other hand, of course, Husserl also indicates that among those objects of the life role, we also find human beings with all their human action and concern, works and suffering, living in common in the life role horizon in their particular social interrelations and knowing themselves to be such. That is to say, the life role is where human beings find their own existence as social, cultural, historical, interpersonal, and bodily. The life role is therefore also essential. In other words, those notions such as intentionality and the life role are to be discovered after epoché and the phenomenological reduction. We can only see those structures after the reduction, not before. It then becomes clear that the presumption to be set aside by epoché are not epistemologically the same with the pre-givenness of our being in the life world. There is therefore no contradiction in accepting both the life world and the reduction. The reduction is a necessity for understanding the life world. So the last point brings us to this topic about the necessity of phenomenological reduction. Although Zahavi rightly notes that the performance of the epoché and the reduction can make us aware of our own constitutive contribution and the extent to which our own subjective accomplishments are at play when worldly objects appear in the way they do and with the validity and the meaning that they have. He nonetheless suggested that the empirical qualitative researchers have no need to perform epoché and the phenomenological reduction when they conduct phenomenological research. This is a quote from Dr. Zahavi. By contrast, my recommendation is that the qualitative research should not only forget about the epoché. There's no need for a general suspension of our natural attitude, but should also approach and investigate the phenomena or conduct the interview in light of quite specific prior ideas and the notions, namely the notion taken from phenomenological theory. That's our surprising advice. Qualitative researchers should forget about getting epoché and the reduction right, since these methodology steps, strictly speaking, are irrelevant for the purpose at hand. So by stating that there's no need for a general substantiation of our natural attitude and that since those methodological steps, strictly speaking, are irrelevant for the purpose at hand. Dr. Zahavi seems to suggest empirical research should stay in the realm of natural attitude and accept all the worldly assumptions of realism. Yet, what is the scientism criticized by phenomenological thinkers? Isn't it the view taking the world as essentially as being material, objective, and the cultural reality? Isn't it the scientific materialism rejected by phenomenology? Without appealing to phenomenological reduction, how can one step out of the totality of our constitutive contribution? That is, for example, scientific materialism. As I know, those neurologists may propose when conducting an empirical qualitative analysis. How can an empirical research be qualified as phenomenological if it founds itself on scientific materialism? Without performing the reduction, a researcher with natural attitude will treat the notions taken from phenomenological theory just like other pre-established theoretical concepts. For example, unconscious attachment, whatever you may like, to be superimposed on the phenomena of investigation. Okay. While we address the necessity of phenomenological reduction, an inevitable question then will be, what is the reduction that can be performed in empirical research? Furthermore, should the meaning and the definition of reduction be only confined in Husserl's transcendental phenomenology, when phenomenology is recognized as an umbrella term and as a movement? For example, in the preface of Phenomenological Perception, I think a lot of people know that, Merleau-Ponty wrote, far from being as has been thought, a procedure of idealistic philosophy, phenomenological reduction belongs to initial philosophy. Heidegger's being in the world appears only against the background of the phenomenological reduction. Okay, maybe you agree, maybe not, but doesn't this mean that there are various versions of phenomenological reduction among those original thinkers in phenomenology? I would suggest, however, that there is no need to argue with which version of reduction is the right one, since through taking up the project of reduction differently, the thinkers all achieved significant understanding to human experience and expanded the scope of phenomenology. With this view, there appears a horizon of the possibility of phenomenological reduction. I will first suggest that it is the methodological horizon of phenomenological reduction that the empirical qualitative researchers should step onto if they are attracted to the phenomenological approach. This step onto can be done by articulating the researcher's own way of performing the phenomenological reduction in accordance with the given condition of an empirical research. For example, I don't know how to pronounce the name. It's also provide their understanding about interviewed description of experience. I think their method have mentioned in Dr. Zahavi's writings. In a phenomenological interview, the experience is co-generated by interviewee and the interviewer together. Therefore, the object of analysis in our case is the co-generated description of experience. So it's not just belong to the interviewee's experience. It's a co-generated description of experience. So I welcome that the authors adheres to the principle of phenomenological evidencing in admitting the data faced by a phenomenological empirical researcher is the co-generated description of experience. I would suggest further, in accordance with the principle of evidencing, that the co-generated description of experience is recorded in a written text, which when it is brought to the researcher. So the research in what is the research in face-to-face encounter is this written text. Okay, it's not that experience. That is to say, what a researcher comes to face-to-face encounter is neither with the interviewee's intact experience nor with the event of the interview, but the written text bearing the interview conversation which thematize the interviewee's experience. So accordingly, the researcher should develop a series of steps for phenomenological reduction that is able to deal with written interview conversation. This would be a process from text to existence, as Paul Ricoeur may suggest. Okay, you know that they has an article or book called, by Ricoeur, the name is From Text to Action. Regarding this matter of dealing with written interview conversation, I have developed a method of reduction based on Heidegger's understanding of language, Ricoeur's hermeneutical phenomenology, and pragmatics in linguistics. Another example of mine in founding research on the basis of phenomenology is that I examined and modified Giorgi's protocol analysis with the phenomenological principle of evidencing in order to have the analysis on first-person description of experience. In addition, to search for a feasible way of performing Husserlian reduction in psychological research, I clarify the confusing idea surrounding the epoché and the reduction among empirical researchers and suggest that the natural attitude to be practiced in the transcendental phenomenological reduction is the belief of cultural temporality in everyday knowing. Furthermore, to my concern with indigenous psychology, I discuss how phenomenology can be a method to achieve the goal of indigenous psychological research, and how the scope of phenomenology gets expanded when it joins the empirical research concerning culture and ethnicity. Okay. I think that it's possible. A lot of people are doing that to articulate your own version about phenomenological reduction. Then it becomes discussable because we have published our writing, our way of doing it, and accept critique and discussion. Okay, then I want to say something about those phenomenological informed interview methods suggested by Dr. Zahavi. Of course, to improve interview techniques is not just welcome but also necessary for phenomenological qualitative research. The detailed and the thorough interview data can serve as a solid foundation for further phenomenological analysis. Nonetheless, an interview method designed with the phenomenological notion is not sufficient to produce phenomenological understanding. With the prevailing of the natural attitude, there is no guarantee that this kind of interview method can grant the researcher the phenomenological attitude. For example, the term pre-reflective used by Manen, who proposed an interview technology named by Dr. Zahavi as the micro-phenomenological interview, only indicate the state of not yet being focused by the consciousness. Just, I think the other author have pointed out that the pre-reflective is that which not yet conscious for phenomenology. Okay. Of course, it's not right in phenomenological sense. Another example is that Dr. Zahavi talked about this method of interview, examination of anomalous self-experience can be said as phenomenologically informed system checklist, a tool for identifying various anomalous self-experience. It is a result of the application of phenomenological understanding, from my point of view, rather than a phenomenological method itself. The result of this kind of improvement of interview for detailed and thorough description of subjective experience is at best phenomenal, but not phenomenological. Not to mention the presumption it holds, like inner cognitive operation and the central theory of neurology. It may be fair to say that the phenomenology here actually means symptomology, as used in the field of psychiatry. Actually, if you check, the term phenomenology on the website, you can find a lot of articles talk about it is not in philosophical field, but in psychiatry, the field of psychiatry. 症状学。How could then a proper way of conducting interview be? How could then a proper way of conducting interview be for phenomenological qualitative research? Surely the interview is a dynamic process in which the interviewer needs to head toward his or her own goal without abstracting the flow of unfolding as the interviewee verbalizes his or her experience. The sequence of unfolding of the interviewee's verbalization should be respected, for it might reveal how the interviewee lives through that experience. So that's why Giorgi will suggest, you need to ask open question, because if you have a structure like is, you will see just what you want to see. You won't see, the experience out of the frame of your checklist. Accordingly, my metaphor for interviewing would be that the interviewee is like our tour guide to the field of a particular human existence. We follow the guide with the preparation for a kind of, I call it phenomenological sightseeing. That is, not just being open-minded or wondering, but seeing with imagining the experiential scene. This is surely an active participation rather than passive hand-off recording. You open up the interview with an open question. Then you, like a tourist, you have your guide, the interviewee. Then you may ask some question for them to elaborate some part in their experience. So you are the follower. The interviewer is the follower. The interviewee is the guide. In this way, the interviewee is allowed to describe his or her experience within the natural attitude. For it's too demanding to expect the interviewee to enter the phenomenological attitude while being interviewed, no matter what kind of interview technique you use. The responsibility of a research being phenomenological is not put onto the shoulders of the interviewer or the interviewee, though the interviewer should be able to conduct good interview, but onto that of the researcher who analyze the data with the method incorporating phenomenological reductions. In other words, the research who engage the phenomenological reductions within the method of analysis would allow the interviewee to address their experience in his or her own way. Okay, so that's my response to Dr. Zahavi's point in his writing, and I just make some notes about when he talks. So a lot of people talk about phenomenologies on the subjective experience, but actually, what is the subjective experience? It's an experience with the natural attitude or the essential structure of the subjective experience. It's very confusing because if we just talk about the subjective, for example, if someone had a brain damage, we say it affects the people's behavior in his life, but how will it affect? Do you know that? We don't know that. So when the person say that, the only way they can describe their experience is within the natural attitude. Okay, and that's the problem for empirical researchers, because I wonder maybe like Husserl, he got the first person experience with the performance of phenomenological reduction. Okay, I put away about all the worldly belief and I can directly observe my own conscious operations. But for us, we have to approach the experience, with the other person's description. So the situation we face is different. But if we still want to stop that kind of totality, how can we do it? Okay, I think that's the problem we faced. Okay, and this is the one of the article. I have the title, Wounded in Temporality. Okay, I have interviewed with those girls with childhood sexual abuse, and then I come up with this understanding about their problem is not some kind of post-traumatic symptom. It's not some kind of traumatic experience. The key problem, the core problem of their life is they don't share with us the linear causality, the linear temporality. So I would say that they're wounded in temporality. Okay, and this is not because I got the idea about temporality, then I was trying to look for the wounded temporality. This is after I perform the phenomenological analysis, then I come to see, wow, that's the key, and it can tell us how they live their life and how we are so they are so isolated from our life. Okay, and I have the other research cooperates with my students, Mufan, he's here right now, and I find the lived experience of qi can be described as the bodily manifestation in perceiving the changing space. Space becomes something you can perceive with quality in this experience. How can you know if you take the three-dimensional space as the eternal truth? How can you come up to see this? Okay, so I think it's transcendental reduction is possible, and is for me it's even necessary, even in doing empirical research. Okay, and the IPA I started my comment on IPA anyway. Okay. Okay, so near the end of Dr. Zahavi's presentation, he talked about the differentiation about phenomenological, psychological reduction, and saying that this is what we all say what the psychologists should do in their research, and this is for transcendental phenomenology. But Husserl, the original idea is that phenomenological psychology can serve as the ground for scientific psychology, but nobody care about that. Nobody believe that. Nobody care about taking you as my ground, right? I'm your ground, okay? And no. Okay. Nobody care about that. So Cookman, talk about this phenomenon, saying that so right now, phenomenological psychology become a branch. A branch in psychology is not the ground of psychology. Okay, maybe we still keep the noble ideal in our mind. We can be your ground, but nobody care about us. It's very hard to get grant if you're doing this research. Okay, so we can just keep it private. Okay, and for me, surely I know the phenomenological psychological reduction is performed within natural attitude. Okay, and this is the reduction to practicing our natural attitude. Like I just mentioned, for me, what constitutes our natural attitude? What constitutes our what is that for us to see these things as something here? Is the cultural temporality. So in performing transcendental reduction, we will practice cultural temporality, linear temporality. Then what is left is the face-to-face encounter here. Okay. So in this way, that's why I can see how those girls with childhood sexual abuse live their life with different form of temporality. So otherwise I would assume everyone live in this kind of linear temporality, because that's the reality. That's nothing to challenge. Okay. I will stop here first, because I think if I go on it will be too long. So that's my presentation, and maybe I will see some reply from Tom. Thank you very much.
He is the very representative in Taiwan for the applied logic. You can make how many
I always keep describing.
Thank you so much. So I think I will just let me see. I think I will make four points, and let me start by some of the stuff you were talking about, vis-a-vis the interview. Let me start with that. So, my understanding, some of the things you said was, you need to be, if you're an interviewer, you need to be a follower rather than a guide, because you have to have this open mind. You basically have to be able to be surprised rather than just imposing your own categories on the kind of experiences of the person you're interviewing. So we have to deal with open questions. And you also said that, that the real phenomenologist is the researcher who subsequently conducts the analysis of the data rather than the interviewer. So I think, I kind of have problems with both claims, I have to say. So first of all, even if there is also an additional work for phenomenologists in the investigation of the data, I don't see why it shouldn't be preferable if the person doing the interview were also phenomenologically inclined, because the obvious problem is, let's just assume that you are a really bad interviewer. You just don't ask sensitive questions. Well, then there is some data, and regardless of what a fantastic phenomenologist the subsequent analyst is, if the data is not, if for instance, the person interviewing asks no questions about temporality, and the person being interviewed offers no information about temporality, then it's kind of hard for the subsequent analyst to say anything of interest about temporality. Obviously,
but I think that's not enough. I can demonstrate that right now if we have time. Anyway.
Okay. So I guess I do think it's important that the person doing the interview. Okay. Yeah. And then I guess the question is whether it's better to have these very open questions or a more semi-structured way of asking questions. And of course, I agree with you that it's not a good thing if you're just going after very specific points, because again, then you won't be surprised and you won't be able to learn anything new. I agree with that, certainly, but I also have a problem. I guess perhaps it depends a bit on what open means, because some examples of open questions I've heard is, well, tell me about your experience, or what was it like for you to be hospitalized? And then they say something, and then you say, could you elaborate a bit more on that? That's very open-minded, or that's very, sorry, I don't know if it's open-minded. It's very open kind of questions. And my problem, of course, is, well, they can keep offering all kinds of trivialities, and you say, well, could you say a little bit more about that? So you're not allowed to say, could you say how was it? How did you feel it in your body, or did you think that your relationship with the others were affected? You're not allowed to ask those questions, because then you're already imposing specific structures. I think that's too restrictive.
Yeah. Sure. Because of course we should be, have that kind of concept, or somehow we have our direction. But about those trivial things, maybe there's something important in those trivial things, because maybe the teacher report that the girl, he want to leave this shelter badly, and I don't know why she just jumped out the window. Since if she just wait for 2 weeks, he can walk from the front door, and it sounds very trivial, right? But what is in that? So I emphasize the analysis, the part of analysis. How can you see something important through this kind of trivial detail.
Yeah. But I just think that were you there? I mean, if you were there, being able to interview the girl, I mean, you would just be in a much better position to gather important information than if you're just left.
Yeah, actually I did the interview by myself, and somehow they were saying maybe it's very sensitive if we talk about with the both girl about their sexual experience, but I just asked and without hesitation, and they feel fine. But anyway, I think sure we need to have that kind of phenomenological background, even that kind of guidance. But when you talk about it, you will use it in a very ordinary way. Okay. So then two. I think I'll just do two more things, and then we should open up. So I just want to say a little bit about your description of ease, because I don't think it was fully fair when you said that what these phenomenological psychiatrists are getting is not really phenomenological descriptions, it's just phenomenal descriptions, and it's kind of symptomatology. I mean, I really don't think it's fair, because that is actually not what they are doing. And I mean, there's this interesting comment by Minkowski, actually, who about Karl Jaspers, who also interested in a certain kind of first-person perspective. So Minkowski was saying about Jaspers that Jaspers was just trying to elicit, symptom descriptions, a kind of endless list of that. And Minkowski was saying, well, that's not the task of the psychiatrist. What the psychiatrist has to do, and I think this is also what these people are doing, they're not just satisfied with all these surface descriptions. They're trying to find the underlying common. So Minkowski talks about the trouble générateur, the kind of underlying disorder that kind of triggers and can explain this manifold of different phenomena. Yeah. And so I think this is, really what the phenomenological psychiatrists are doing, and so I don't think it's just symptomatology. But they are still follow causality, right?
Yeah, but then we come there. Okay, but then that takes me to the last point, which is probably the most fundamental, and where I really think there is a deep disagreement between us, because one way. So basically, what you were saying was, okay, if you want to do phenomenological qualitative research, you need to break with the natural attitude, and that's why you need the epoché and the reduction. Because if you do not do that, you will basically remain caught in the kind of standard scientific reductionist materialistic worldview. And I really think that's a mistake. And before saying why, I mean, just think for a second, what would be the implication? I mean, if you were right, I mean, presumably the implication would be that nobody can do qualitative research unless they have performed the epoché and the reduction. They can't do it. I mean, they might claim that they are not being phenomenologists, but they have to be, because otherwise they would just be interested in quantitative, reductive, objectifying, third-personal analysis. And I mean, that's just that's kind of strange implication. And I think many qualitative researchers would say, what do we care? We are just going to continue doing our qualitative research. We don't want to bother with the epoché and reduction. We are interested in, subjective meaning and blah. I mean, all of that. So there's something. I just think there's a strange implication. And I would then say what I think is the fundamental mistake, and it's actually one that I think Morley has done also in his reply to the phenomenology of nursing. And also this very interesting article by Davidson from the 1991. I think he was also one of Giorgi's students. I think the problem is the following. I mean, we need to distinguish the natural attitude and the naturalistic attitude.
Right.
And I agree, of course, completely that you cannot do qualitative research unless you get out of the naturalistic attitude, because if you are caught in the naturalistic attitude, then you do precisely see everything in objectifying, quantitative terms. I agree with that, but just add, I think this is very clear in Husserl, the naturalistic attitude and the natural attitude is not the same thing.
Of course, yeah.
So Husserl talks about the natural attitude, and he then makes a distinction between the personalistic attitude and the naturalistic attitude. Both of these attitudes are attitudes within the natural attitude. The personalistic attitude is the one we normally find ourselves in. That's where we treat other people as conscious creatures, minded creatures. And the naturalistic attitude is this very kind of strange scientific way we can start looking at others as mere kind of body machines. So my point would be, what we need to do as quality researchers is to have the personalistic attitude, but you don't need to break with the natural attitude in order to have the personalistic attitude, because the personalistic attitude is part of the natural attitude. And so for that reason, I would say you don't need the epoché and the reduction.
Yeah. If we want to study this part of, we perform naturalistic, the practicing of naturalistic attitude.
Okay.
Okay, but if we perform the practicing of natural attitude, then I practice here the perceiver as an empirical ego.
Okay.
You know.
Okay.
Now I become the one being constituted within this relationship.
Sure.
So the first, when we practice the naturalistic attitude, we know this and that. So maybe we know this person with brain damage, but if we practice natural attitude, we are not see him as a person with brain damage. We see this person live his or her life. You know, the manifestation of the way he or she live his or her life here. So I am practicing that kind of presumption of the empirical ego here. So it's different. I know it's different, and so that's what we have to do as a clinical psychologist.
Okay, but then I guess we should kind of conclude. But I guess my problem is just, again, nurses are very interested in phenomenology. They want to use phenomenology in their research, they want to use phenomenology in their clinical practice. I think it's correct to say that you might be able to offer better healthcare as a nurse if you take on certain phenomenological ideas. But I don't understand why the nurse, in order to be able to understand the patient, has to bracket her empirical ego.
What is the essence of nursing? What is the essence? What is the essence of a nursing? For a nurse. Okay.
I suggest because the first part we must always we have another opportunity for you in the.
Maybe he can just finish his thought. I think let him finish his thought.
So just this one nurse. Yes.
Yeah, I'm a nurse. I treat this person as this or that, and I haven't really realized what kind of nursing, the essence of nursing I'm doing here. But if I would suggest, yes, that's one kind of phenomenology, practicing the naturalistic attitude. But that's another level, another different kind of, for example, research. We practicing that kind of nursing. What is nursing here? Because it's the nursing, the essence of nursing, constitute this relationship and also make me a nurse as such. So. I'm just take for granted what I do is nursing. Okay, so in this way we have better understanding about what nursing really is.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now
I think it's important. Continue.
This is important. I want to get another opinion from nursing professor here. He's one of the representative. Applied phenomenology from National Yangming University, nursing professor. Yeah. Okay. Professor Xu. Yeah. Okay.
Okay, I'm very happy to hear that Li talking about he's a nurse. He's doing nursing. However, a real nurse is here. I think he just mentioned one word. it seems that he has some kind of image about what is nursing, and also talk about some take for granted one. So I think that's why we need a phenomenology. Not only you think about what is your profession as a nurse or nursing, I think it's also the same as the psychology. So the phenomenological psychology make them different within the psychology field. So I think there's, and I appreciate this kind of conversation. I think there's no conflict. It's important for us, like after listening to your lecture, I think I'm quite fortunate because I went to United States in 1990. I learned the lived experience. So I think because I would like to say that there's such important relationship between phenomenology and nursing. Just like I think that's a wonderful example. We can.
Psychotherapy example.
I just want to take your example. When you are a nurse, it's not that you do nursing by what you think is nursing. It's important that you know how your patient think. What's a life world to that person. So I think so we have to do some phenomenological reduction or epoché. What makes we as a nurse, what's our previous us to become a nurse, and how can I treat this person? So yeah, I think it's interesting because I think there's some kind of probably potential argument because I always think about what's the difference between the Husserl, the phenomenology, and the Heidegger's phenomenology, because I think everyone knows the big argument about the bracketing. There's no absolute bracketing or epoché. That's made Heidegger use the hermeneutic. Everyone has a pre-understanding, full concept. Then we go to the hermeneutic circle. I think even this kind of dialogue, I think we just go into the hermeneutic circle. We tend to understand people. We tend to examine ourselves, how we think. Your speech also inspired me to think about my teacher. Her name is Nancy Dickelman. I think it's the very special point is that he made the group analysis for how to interpret data. And when I was there, and then I have a group of people, then I can examine myself, and then I can have a different conversation or change my idea with my colleague, my classmates. And also, I think she has a good reputation about hermeneutic pedagogy. He used hermeneutic type of thinking put into the education, not focus on the behavioral. It's a dialogue. It's through the narrative, the power of narrative. So I think sometimes it can be dangerous when we try to examine people or ask some question. In psychiatric field or psychiatric nursing field, the exploring is not different from it. It's different from the exploring and the probing. So when we try, I think it's important how we interact with people. If you have some previous kind of image, you are a nurse, you are a philosopher, you are a clinical psychologist. That power relationship is not so equal. That's what I think. So it's always train us how to be a good phenomenological researcher, how we interact with people, how we really get into the people's life world, letting freely people, freely talk about and share their experiences. I think a lot of kind of phenomenology is really train us to be a good good nurse. Thank you.
Okay. I suggest because another from the Hualian, yeah.
Well, I think I have this.
Wong can talk
Okay, I have
something.
similar questions with Dr. Lee, and I'm thinking about. I want to elaborate the discussion of the blurred area on psychopathology and psychotherapy. Okay, and I'm thinking about the similarity between qualitative researcher and psychoanalyst, and also psychotherapist. Because when we are gathering data from the interviewees, it's quite similar to the process that we are collecting the data from the patients. And at the beginning stages, we try to ask opening questions, and we try not to guide. And then we find a direction, and that becomes the trace to focus on intervention. Okay, so in my mind, I try to think about this as similar stages about you're collecting the data between the interview and the beginning stage of psychoanalysis. And then I want to echo that to Wei-Lun's response about systemology and psychopathology, in which that's the question I want to ask today. Yeah, because every research has its property. Yeah. So when every research has its property, for example, the research about psychology and the research about nursing. So when we are doing a qualitative researcher as a psychological practitioner, okay, I am there in the position of a psychological researcher, okay, and that's similar to therapy, okay, and that's why we can conduct the research, conducting the results relative to psychopathology, okay. So let's see here. If we are making the interview suggests, okay, I'm thinking that whether we are putting ourselves into a position of nowhere, nobody, okay, yeah, and we are actually, in my idea, when we are doing a research with the interviewee, and that's actually the beginning of an ethical relationship, and we are actually collecting data through the understanding process and the deepening relationship between me and my interviewee. And as such, when we are facing, for example, a boy, ADHD, okay, showing aggressive behavior, chaotic emotions, and so we could ask some opening question, but without the sense, and without the developing relationship, we would never know that this chaotic behaviors and chaotic emotions is actually due to the traumatic experiences. Okay, so I think that echoes the Professor Lee's responses that we are actually developing our interview process and data through the ongoing relationships. So that's my question.
Okay. Who want to raise another question? Very short. We maybe later, just 3 minutes to make the conclusion.
Maybe,
to close this first part. Yeah. No?
I just reply?
Yeah,
Maybe
maybe
Okay.
reply to these two comments.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, but I don't know how much I have to say to the intervention about nursing. I guess I just want to highlight one thing again. So you mentioned the difference between Husserl and Heidegger, the difference between Husserl and Heidegger, and the hermeneutical circle. The fact that we always pre-understandings, and that should somehow, problematize the epoché. But I think I just need once more to emphasize that in a kind of technical sense, the epoché is not about bracketing all our prejudices and presumptions. This is simply not its purpose. The specific purpose, and that's how Husserl introduces it in Ideas 1, is to suspend what he calls the Generalthesis. I mean, this very fundamental assumption about the mind-independent existence of the world. That's its purpose. There might be all kinds of reasons why we cannot, and I think Heidegger's right, I don't think we can suspend all our assumptions and prejudices, and I think many of them are important in order for us to understand what is going on. I mean, you can think of Gadamer here. So I agree with all of that, but I just don't think that really bears on the question of whether the epoché is to be needed or not. And I mean, so again, I just want to say once more, I mean, the epoché is about bracketing the natural attitude, and I think the important question is that something that people who want to conduct qualitative research or use phenomenology in nursing, do they have to bracket the natural attitude? And my perspective is I still don't understand why that should be necessary, because I think bracketing the natural attitude is a very, very specific transcendental philosophical move, and I think it's kind of, I just don't understand why anybody else should bother with it. I'm sorry. Okay, so then your question, I mean, I think there were two issues in it. One was this idea about the interview process, to some extent being a collaborative enterprise. Yeah. And I think this is also what Höfting and Martini were arguing when they talk about it being co-generated experiential descriptions. I mean, Höfting and Martini are both my former PhD students, so there's a kind of very close connection here. So I agree with all of that, but I just think that if we take that serious, the idea that we need jointly somehow to facilitate this process of experiential description, well then it is absolutely urgent to ask the right questions. I mean, I just don't see how one can speak of co-generation unless there's also a kind of active participation by the interviewer. And I don't think you should be saying anything different. And this is one thing I want to say. The other thing I want to say is kind of more, I think it points to an issue that we haven't really discussed, which might be the difference between doing psychotherapy and say doing the kind of psychopathological interview, because the aims are very, very different. The psychiatrists are interested in a diagnosis.
But it has some blurred area because some symptoms only showed in relationship. Unless you are in certain kind of relationships, you can find this symptom.
Okay, but I guess my point was slightly different. I think what I wanted to say was that, and I mean, perhaps I'm just speaking now out of my own ignorance, but I mean, I would assume that when it comes to psychotherapy, I mean, it's very much about, to some extent, letting the person speak, because even silence might trigger thoughts that can, I mean, where the patient can open up. So it's not, so the psychotherapist does not really have a clear agenda. And I think that just makes the situation very different from, and also the psychotherapist presumably is not interested in essential structures. The psychotherapist is primarily interested in the specific individual in front of him or her, whereas I take it that that the psychiatrists, again, they're trying to come up with a diagnosis. They're trying to determine, are these symptoms present? Because if they are present, then it will be schizophrenia rather than bipolar disorder. So I mean, even though they are interested in the individual, there's also a very strong kind of lean towards kind of more eidetic structures, and I think that, and I think for that reason, it might be necessary for more guided questions than are needed in a more psychotherapeutic context. So I'm just kind of opening it up. It could be that if you're using phenomenology in psychotherapy, which of course also can happen with the psychiatric patients after they have gotten the diagnosis. I mean, that's not where it ends. That's something where it starts. And of course you can engage with psychotherapy there. It might be that phenomenology used in that context, and the phenomenology used when you're kind of trying to come up with a diagnosis is really two very different ways of using it, and we can't just say it's one and the same. We need to recognize that there might be important differences.
Yeah.
Okay, we have another topic to discuss, but now just 2 minutes.
It's very obvious. Okay, very obvious. Okay. I still take nursing as an example. What is nursing? Then we will ask. Then we will answer. The nursing is what a nurse do, and what is a nurse? A nurse is a person trained in a nursing profession. So we got a virtuous circle. Okay. So I don't know what is nursing. That's why I began ask what is nursing. Okay. This man called patient and this called nurse. Is this a nursing I'm doing? Or if we want to know what is nursing, we have to say, if you want to know, I say what is nursing, you do to the person. Then you talk about a lot of trivial things. That's where we find the essence of nursing. So that's why I have in this area I talk about the practice into face-to-face encounter. So in this way, we just step outside from the circle about nursing is what a nurse do, and a nurse is what we train in the nursing position of patient. Yeah.
So just one, because I actually think that if one talks about phenomenology of nursing, so what is that? And you can find people who are saying, for instance, Crotty wrote a really, I think, interesting book in the 90s about phenomenology of nursing. And so he said, and he had a lot of criticism, but anyway, he also ended up with kind of trying to explain what phenomenology of nursing was. And I think he was wrong, because he said phenomenology of nursing is to try to understand the nursing phenomenon. It's the essence of nursing, exactly as you were saying. And to me, for me, that just sounds extremely kind of navel-centered, as if I want to do phenomenology of nursing, I want to understand better kind of what I'm doing. Well, but that's, for me, it's a bit strange. I thought the point of doing phenomenology of nursing was to be able to help the patients, care about them, understanding them better. So there's a certain, I just think there's a certain self-reflective scrutiny in talking about phenomenology of nursing that I just find strange. And phenomenological psychiatry is not about the phenomenology of the psychiatric practice. Phenomenology of psychiatry is about psychopathology, trying to understand the way in which the life world of different patients are disordered. So it's kind of two very different perspectives. Anyway, we can continue.
Yeah, we can continue forever.
We stop here. I think the next part is not separated with our part this time. So about 10 minutes break.
Let's actually.
We begin with our discussion and some problem raising. In Gali or words. I think the first is 7 others. 7 others. Yeah. Okay. Then some this is legacy. Somebody read.
So I think actually a better continuation is legacy. It looks like it.
Who's the legacy?
Yeah, because we were just talking about natural attitude.
Who's the legacy? Yeah. Who's the legacy? Who's the legacy is about the problem whether phenomenology, especially Husserl phenomenology, metaphysics is, yeah, and this metaphysics, according to Zahavi's interpretation, has a spatial sense. Is transcendental idealism, yeah? And it has to do with the concept of reality. So naturally, in the last part, in the Husserl legacy, Zahavi has raised the same problem, yeah, especially, regarding the problem of naturalization of the phenomenology, and he suggested some way, for example, with cooperation with neuroscientific investigation, and he has another suggestion. I think is very positive. So the last part is connected with 7 others at the beginning. Or the Zahavi has. I think he has a special the opposite. This plan or his aim is to the philosophical explanation to some special problem is not enough. Then we maybe need some proof or some from the side of scientific science. But this is especially
So what should I do? I mean, should I say a little bit about what I think?
Yeah. Okay. So I begin my whether it's wrong or the right. So it's a text.
Okay. So I guess the way the book is set up is that I basically start by saying that a lot of Husserl's analysis are being used in not just applied phenomenology, but certainly also in different areas of philosophy. And I then asked the question, is that the right way to secure Husserl's legacy? Is this the way for him to continue living in modern philosophy, that one might be influenced by his discussion of intentionality or empathy or life work, etc., etc. And then I basically say that I don't think that Husserl himself would have been satisfied with just people parceling out specific small domains of his thinking, because for him what was important was this overarching transcendental project that he was engaged in. And then I say that my aim in the book is to try to make as much sense as I can out of that transcendental project, to try to describe what I think it is. And then we need to see whether that is also something that is kind of that remains contemporary interest. And then in my way of kind of spelling it out, I guess one important move is to insist, is to have a discussion with those who have argued that Husserlian phenomenology is not engaged in any kind of metaphysics. Because there is a lot there are some very influential interpreters, including people that I admire a lot, who have argued that who has argued that Husserl's transcendental project is metaphysically neutral, so it doesn't concern itself with issues of realism and idealism, which are kind of supposed to belong to either a kind of a different set of problems, or perhaps a set of problems that we shouldn't concern ourselves with anymore. And I then say that I don't think this is a correct interpretation of Husserl. I think that Husserl, in the logical investigations, there he was metaphysically neutral, but I think, and this is kind of a bit surprising perhaps for some, that precisely the moment where he made his transcendental turn, the moment he started employing the epoché and the reduction, rather than that making his phenomenology metaphysically neutral, I think that was precisely what made it not metaphysically neutral anymore, because the whole point of forming the epoché and the reduction, as I've also said earlier, was to try to highlight this question of whether or not the world is mind-dependent or not. And I take that to be a very fundamental metaphysical question, which of course has to do with the realism-idealism problem. And then I basically say that, I give a lot of evidence in support of the claim that Husserl is a transcendental idealist. And then of course the big question is, well, because I don't think that's so controversial, he says that so many places, the difficult thing is to understand what exactly that is supposed to mean. What does it mean to be a transcendental idealist? And I then discuss a variety of different options and basically come down on a kind of correlationist take. which basically, where the basic idea is, I mean, roughly speaking, that we cannot really understand mind and world independently of one another. So mind is world involving and world is mind involving, and for that very reason, Husserl is not a realist. He's certainly also not an idealist in the classical sense, where this is supposed to entail a reduction of the world to the mind, or an elimination of the difference between the mind and the world. That's not the kind of idealist he is. But he's an idealist in the sense that he thinks that we can give no meaning to, or there's no plausible understanding of the world that separates it entirely from the mind. And then, in the final kind of part, I then have some reflections upon to what extent that makes Husserl's transcendental philosophy different from Kant's transcendental philosophy. And I point out that issues of embodiment, facticity, and intersubjectivity are very important to Husserl's conception of the transcendental, and that since that is the case, I mean, there is a certain fluidity or flexibility in his system. Actually, system is not the right word, but it is a way of understanding these matters that also potentially allow for a certain engagement with empirical research. And so that's where we have this discussion of the naturalizing project. So I'm not saying that in order to make progress on these deep philosophical questions, we necessarily need to engage with neuroscientists. I mean, I think the point is rather that if we as phenomenologists are interested in the way in which consciousness and mind are intertwined, well, then we should also have the most sophisticated understanding of the mind. And here I think there are a number of empirical disciplines that can help philosophers, because philosophers have the tendency of remaining in their armchair and operating with very kind of general descriptions. And I mean, if you then go out to psychiatrists and nurses or anthropologists or developmental psychologists, I mean, they will often spend a lot of time describing in a very fine-grained manner the very phenomena that we are interested in. And I think the phenomenology can learn from that. And I think that's a kind of a different take than, say, the one we find in Kant, for instance. Then I have some concluding observations. But I mean, so the basic idea is to say Husserl is a transcendental idealist. That position has metaphysical implications. Doesn't mean that he's a Kantian idealist. It doesn't mean that he's a Berkeleyan idealist. In fact, I'm basically making the case that Husserl's transcendental idealism can be seen as Husserl's effort of preserving a certain kind of everyday realism, because he wants to say, tables and chairs are perfectly real. They are not mental representations. They are not mental constructs. They are not phenomena that conceal a noumenal reality. So it's very much about giving reality back to the life world. And Husserl thinks that the best way to do that is by opting for a transcendental idealist position. And then I say that, I'm kind of saying I don't want to prejudice whether this is then a plausible position that we should continue to adopt, but at least this is, the most plausible interpretation of Husserl that I can kind of, that I can come up with. And I then say that on some of these matters, Husserl seems to be much more in accordance with a number of central 20th century thinkers than one normally assumes, because often one thinks of Husserl as somebody who was stuck in the 19th century, and then Heidegger and all the other phenomenologists were kind of 20th century thinkers. But I think Husserl, in many ways, by doing what he did, actually is in line with a lot of very important 20th century thinkers. And so I think that's how close we should understand his kind of more overarching project.
May I raise some more concrete question? At first, when you read your book, we find a term is givenness. For example, the world is given to me through life experience. This is an explanation of the transcendental because through the experience and the given, yeah. So I don't know what is the given. Given is pre-given. It's a presupposition or some, yeah, because this term, the given is confused. The second is, you have mentioned Kant, fundamental idealism, and on the other hand, Kant said is empirical realism. Yeah. Do you think that in Husserl, empirical realism makes sense? Naturally, the both philosophers, have different positions, especially in Kant is understanding and the sensation are separated, but in Husserl is continuity. Yeah. So, but empirical realism, transcendental idealism, together can make sense in Husserl. That is the second question.
Okay, so I think it's kind of easier for me to answer the second question, because I do think that Husserl would precisely agree that what he wants to do is to secure or preserve. He wants to preserve empirical realism, and he thinks the way to do that is by endorsing transcendental idealism. And so again, just be clear about the difference between empirical realism and, say, scientific or metaphysical realism. So empirical realism obviously is the idea that the objects we are surrounded by and the objects of experience are real. And I think Husserl would absolutely endorse that claim. I mean, they're not unreal, they're not less real. It's not as if there isn't for reality no table, there are only molecules or atoms, and he would not accept that kind of talk. So I think he's an empirical realist. He's not but of course, empirical realist means that chairs and tables are real. It doesn't mean that they are mind independent. So it's not that kind of realism. And of course, Kant would say the same, but there are of course differences, because Kant's way of ensuring the reality of the phenomenal domain is by including a reference to the noumenal dimension and to das Ding an sich, and obviously this is a move that Husserl wants to reject. And I mean, you can kind of find that rejection from the Dodge investigations and all the way to crisis. I mean, Husserl do not want to accept the idea that there is a thing in itself that forever will remain elusive or ungraspable for us. So I think there are important differences, and I mean, perhaps one could put it this way, that even if both of them want to combine transcendental idealism with empirical realism, I guess one could ask whether Kant ultimately is able to do that, or whether his distinction between the phenomenal and the noumenal actually means that the empirical realism ultimately dissolves, because ultimately it is not fully real, because there is something more real than the phenomenon, namely the noumenal. I mean, I realize that there are different Kant interpretations as well, and I mean, this might be one, and there might be other ways of reading him, but at least, I guess this is at least a kind of a fairly prevalent one. But then the question about the given, I mean, I'm not sure I fully understand, because
you have mentioned me, give to me, give me, but me is with the dative.
Yes.
Dative, yes. So that means someone gives something to me.
No, it should be assumed that way, because that seems to presuppose that there is a giver. I don't think the point, I mean, that makes it sound a bit theological. I don't think that was the aim. It's not as if there is somebody who gives something to me. The point is rather that, I mean, so one way to talk about it is to say that any appearance is always an appearance of something for someone. Any givenness is always a givenness of something for someone. So givenness refers to something that is given. It doesn't refer to somebody who gives something. And I think so. I think this is just another way of talking about appearances and about experience. And I think surely, this is partly what phenomenology is about. Offering these descriptions of different modes of givenness. So I can think about a laptop. You close my eyes, think about a laptop. I can imagine a laptop. I can perceive a laptop. These are different ways. It's a perceptual, imaginative, signative way of givenness of one and the same object. A perceptual object can be given, in different ways. I can walk around it. It reveals itself operationally. So these are all very basic, components of Husserl's phenomenological analysis.
So can we say it's not from me? It's given. It's not from me.
It's not from me,
but
it's
me.
for
It's
me.
But not from me.
Not from me.
Right. Not given. It's not from me.
Yes,
but
yes.
maybe it's not from someone, but not from me.
No, of course.
Yeah.
But it seems to me that Zahavi used this term givenness to guarantee the reality. To guarantee the reality is in spite of sometimes we fall in the fantasy. I think your
I don't know. I'm not entirely sure. I don't know what you have in mind because I think
It's not from him.
It's legacy. In the beginning, the givenness.
A lot of times the word given has the
Given.
meaning of it's there.
Okay.
Right?
It's there. Something's
there.
real.
Yeah.
Something's real.
Yeah, well, okay. So
Yeah.
sorry. So here's another two different things. One is, in order to speak of reality, I think what Husserl wants to insist upon is that givenness is to some extent not enough. If we're talking about reality, we need intersubjectivity as well. So things can be given for me alone in as vivid a manner as possible. That in it and of itself does not make it real. It only becomes real if what is given to me is something I can share with others. And so for that reason, Husserl is very insistent upon the importance of intersubjectivity for the constitution of objectivity. So I think it's an absolutely fundamental feature of his thinking. That's one point. The other point has to do with this question of facticity. So perhaps that's what you have in mind. So one might say, well, if the whole analysis somehow has to presuppose a certain givenness, there seems to be something that cannot be explained any further. And in fact, there are some people who have argued, I think this is wrong, but some people who have argued that because Husserl operates with this element of facticity that cannot be explained further, but that we just have to, if you will, take as a given, he is not a transcendental philosopher, but rather a kind of empiricist. Because the argument is that Kant would not allow such an appeal to facticity into his transcendental philosophy, because everything has to be transcendentally deduced, otherwise it's not justified. And I think that many people have done that in the past, kept insisting on the fact that facticity is indeed crucial for Husserl's process of constitution. So it's precisely not just me who is inventing the world out of my mind. There is a facticity that I kind of need to address, but I don't think that means. But I would agree with the person who claimed that means that Husserl is not a transcendental philosopher, because the only thing it proves is that he's not a Kantian transcendental philosopher. But there are different ways of doing transcendental philosophy, and we shouldn't just say that unless you do it in Kant's way, you're not a transcendental philosopher anymore. And I think that's just stupid.
Can we say, come back to this sentence, word is given to me through life experience. The first part, word is given. Then in this situation, I'm just in the natural attitude.
But I have the document in front of me, and I'm just searching. World is given. I can't find that anywhere in the text. Where
Givenness.
World is what is the exact sentence? I mean, it's just
maybe this sentence is variated by me, but I just the similar sense.
Okay,
so I want to. Giving is just in a natural attitude, but through my experience, so it's come to the transcendental.
Well, actually, I don't know. Okay, so I don't really agree with that, because I do think. So one might think in the following way: if you talk about facticity, and if you talk about something that is given, perhaps the claim would then be, okay, then we have basically renounced basically attempt of doing phenomenology, because that is to return both to the natural attitude and to the naturalistic attitude. Because what is given, is something that is causally affecting us, and then we are basically trying to explain each and every type of experience as a result of the causal impact of something given. And I mean, I don't think that is how one ought to understand Husserl. I mean, first of all, I don't think the proper way of understanding the relationship between the given and the subject is in causal terms. And secondly, referring to facticity is not, and I think Husserl is very explicit about that, is not to say that what is factical there mind independently. I mean, so it's not as if, well, there is a certain brute facticity, and then, consciousness suddenly emerges, and then it can relate to the facticity, and at some point there might be a huge world destruction, and all human beings cease to exist, and then there's no longer any consciousness, but there's still a lot of brute facticity. I mean, I don't think Husserl would talk of it in that way. So the facticity that he's referring to is still something that is caught up in the correlational circle. So it's always facticity in relationship to someone, and for that reason, I don't think it's kind of falling back into the kind of naive realism that he's trying to criticize.
Can we say that it's like the identity? My identity is given to me, so this given is not talk about this thing. It's indicate to me. I'm a subject. Now I have an understanding about my own position, because this givenness. So it's actually talk about my relationship with this entity. It's not just about this entity is real or not. Yeah, because it's about this. Let me know, it's not from me, and I'm limited. I'm finite.
So I guess another way of putting it is the facticity is somehow to be contrasted with the notion of creation ex nihilo. So I mean, I don't invent myself out of nothing. There's a facticity to me, but there's also a facticity to the world. I mean, it's not me who is kind of producing the world out of nothing. So, but I don't think that doesn't entail that we have then suddenly become naive realists, saying that the world is out there and we are just mirroring it in some way.
I think because in Husserl legacy, is the self is also very important. So then in 7 others, we can slowly come to the topics of self.
Okay.
Minimalistic.
Yes, right. So, do you want to summarize something on it?
Minimalistic?
Well,
very.
I could try to do just a really brief.
Okay. I think it's better that I do it.
Yes. Yes.
It's just that the project itself and other is kind of very different from Husserl's legacy, because Husserl's legacy is primarily a Husserl interpretation. And I mean, self and other, even though I'm drawing on Husserl, is not primarily a Husserl interpretation. It's primarily a kind of systematic work. And I guess it's basically divided into 3 different parts. In the first part, I'm trying to basically to understand the relationship between self and consciousness. To what extent is consciousness fundamentally self-involving? To what extent is the notion of is a reference to self unavoidable if we want to talk about experience? So that's one of the main ideas that I'm trying to defend in the first part, and I'm then doing that by considering all kinds of different objections, and I'm also suggesting that even if it might be legitimate to talk of a self that is entailed the moment there's any experience, that very minimal notion of self is not, it doesn't do human selfhood justice, because the human selfhood is actually a much more complicated phenomena. So the minimal self is, so to speak, just the bottom layer, the inner core, and then there will be a lot of other dimensions or aspects that also has to be considered, for instance, also kind of more normative or narrative or extended conceptions of self. So that's the first part. Then in the second part, I basically raised the question, if it is the case that one kind of, if one commits to the idea that consciousness is fundamentally self-involving, and if one commits to the idea that the first person character of consciousness is absolutely fundamental, then some people might say that such a view from the outset prevents one from ever being able to address the problem of intersubjectivity in a kind of plausible way. Because the argument is, if we start with a self, then we won't be able to solve the problem of other minds. And some people have said the only way to solve the problem of other minds, the only way to really come up with a plausible account of intersubjectivity, is by postulating or operating with a certain level that is more fundamental than the division between self and other. So some kind of undifferentiation that is the first stage of consciousness. And so the claim could be that if one takes my view, well, then you have just lost the fight against, you have lost the chance of understanding intersubjectivity and are basically condemned to some form of solipsism. And what I then try to do in the second part is to say that it's precisely the other way around. It's only if you start with the kind of minimal first-personal view on consciousness that you will be able to come up with a plausible account of intersubjectivity. Because intersubjectivity is a relationship between subjects, intersubjectivity, so it requires a certain understanding of the subjective or first-person character of consciousness, and I then try to show that more concretely by saying that many of the phenomenologists, including Husserl, who were so insistent upon the first-person character of consciousness, spent a lot of time discussing empathy, trying to show how. So I was basically trying to show that many of the people who have defended who has given a very central importance to the first-person character of consciousness, have actually also offered some very sophisticated accounts of social and intersubjective experience, accounts that I think are partly superior to some of the alternative proposals in contemporary debates. And so, and the second part then ends up with kind of focusing to some extent on this, on my relationship to how I can come to understand others in a kind of experientially direct way. But then I end part two by saying, well, there's something a bit strange about this idea that the most fundamental way of encountering others is by me observing these others. Because the most fundamental encounter doesn't seem to be a one-sided encounter, but rather a face-to-face encounter where it's not just about me observing somebody else, even if it's directly, but it's also about me engaging with somebody who's simultaneously engaging with me. And then in the third part, I basically use that idea to kind of do different things. On the one hand, I'm trying to call attention to certain types of self-experience which are socially mediated. So ways of understanding and experiencing myself that I do not have on my own, but which I only have as a result of encountering others and kind of taking on their kind of perspective on me. And I exemplify that by my discussion of shame as a potent example of that. And then in the final chapter, I discuss the notion of the we, and basically argue that in order to understand the we, these kind of dyadic I-thou relations might play a very important role. Basically, so the book came out in 2014, the final chapter, and I think I also write that, was basically a kind of gesture towards work I would be doing subsequently. And I mean, since then I have done much more work on the we, and it's also what I'm currently continuing to work on.
Thank you very much. So, in our okay, Tony.
So the question is about the previous book, if that's all right. Because I was going to ask, but you didn't.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Yes.
That's fine. So it's about some passages in chapter 4. Chapter 4 is internalism, externalism, and transcendental idealism. So specifically in page 117, so it's section 4.5, beyond internalism and externalism. You briefly discuss some views from Dan Zahavi, and I'll read several sentences and answer the question. So nearby the bottom, a more radical move was effectuated by the phenomenologists who rejected the notion of the thing as unintelligible and nonsensical. In their view, mind and world are not distinct entities, rather they are bound constitutively together. To put it differently, phenomenologists would typically argue that the relation between the mind and world is an internal relation constitutive of its reality and not an external one of causality. So I find it very helpful to use that kind of remarks to understand what, for example, McDowell was up to in mind and world. But there might be a further complication. So when he uses the word world, I think what he has in mind is one distinction from Gadamer, the distinction between world and environment. Right? So we all share the environment with other animals and human infants, but linguistic beings are initiated into the second nature and so on. So I'm just wondering if adding that further complication, what would you rearrange the materials here? For example, we all agree that we should get rid of the nominal world. But should we say that the world and environment in Gadamer's sense is a further distinction within the phenomenal world? And if not, what should we think about that distinction?
I think so. I mean, I guess there is a kind of an interesting discussion in what's it called? I don't remember the term, but you know, Uxküll. I mean, there's this old discussion in 1910-20 about environment and niches, and I guess why am I referring to that old discussion? Because there is this question about whether it makes sense to speak of an environment independently of creatures that inhabit it and are at home in it. And I mean, if you kind of accept that idea, well, then I think it is fairly clear that an environment necessarily is correlational. It has to. It doesn't. I mean, in a mind, in a universe with no living creatures, I mean, there would be no environments. I don't really know what that would be, but that would certainly not be environments, because environments are precisely environments offering specific possibilities for creatures that have adapted to that. So I'm not sure environment per se would be such a challenge for this way of thinking.
So I didn't mean that to be a challenge.
No,
so in that case, maybe we need a third notion. So maybe the external reality and environment and world in a very strict sense. So I guess the question is, does that distinction between the world and environment, so how does it map onto your discussion here?
Okay, but I think fundamentally speaking, I don't think that's a distinction that the phenomenologists are operating with.
Okay.
I mean, quite similar. Another way of talking is, well, what do they mean by world? So I don't think that they would say. I don't really know about Heidegger, but I don't think Husserl would say that a world is necessarily linguistic. I mean, it would be. I mean, the kind of technical term technical definition he provides of world is the horizon of horizons. So it has something to do with the, I guess, the perspectival character of our experience. You know, that whenever we experience a certain entity, it's also always embedded within a certain foreground, background, and the world is, so to speak, the ultimate horizon or the ultimate background of all backgrounds. So there's no, I think, specific reference to language here, and it's clear that that way of talking is very much tied up with, you know, an experience or a plurality of experiences. And I don't think, I don't need it. So in Schütz, for instance, I mean, you do find notions like Umwelt, Mitwelt, Vorwelt, Folgewelt, so environmental world, surrounding world, the world of my predecessors, the world of my successors. So there are kind of some further distinctions to be made, which I think makes a lot of sense if you're talking about different dimensions of social reality. So, you know, there are the people I'm sharing the current context with, the people who coexist with me but are not physically present. There are my ancestors who keep influencing me even though they are dead, and they are my successors. I mean, all of that makes sense, but again, none of this would be would kind of challenge or would be irrelevant, you know. It wouldn't, I think, force the phenomenologists to modify their basic take on the extent to which world and mind are connected.
Okay, thank you. I'll think.
Should we at first concentrate on the concept of self?
Yes.
And minimalistic self. Do you have some questions?
So when we were reading the Self and Other book, which is really interesting, and the question that keeps coming up is still we feel when we're reading it, it's the minus, the very minimal experiential aspect of the self, which is very crucial to this whole project, right? And it's still not entirely clear to us. You probably are very clear, but it's just to us, the relational aspect, not very clear. So maybe you can remind us, or maybe very briefly explain, the idea. Sorry, you wrote the book about it.
It's just, I'm trying to explain it as clearly as possible. It just seems, I just seem to be failing constantly, so I don't know. I mean, but let me try, nevertheless, to try to explain what I mean by it. I mean, there are different examples I'm using. So I mean, one of the examples is this idea that if we want to describe consciousness, I mean, there are different kind of dimensions we need to attend to. So for instance, I can perceive the laptop and I can perceive the table. So if you want to explain the difference, you can say, well, in both cases there's a perception going on, but the objects are different. So if we want to understand, the variety, the possible variations in my experiential life, I mean, changing objects obviously changes something. Then one can say, okay, but I mean, there's of course not just perception. I can perceive the laptop, I can also remember the laptop, I can imagine the laptop. In all of those cases, there also seems to be relevant differences. So differences in experience isn't just about objects, it's also about act time and type of intentional act that one is engaged in. And then I asked the following question, if we compare a sequence of experiences where I first have an experience, where I first perceive the laptop and then I remember the table. Then we can say, but the object has obviously changed and the act time has obviously changed. And then I asked, does that mean that there's nothing left in common, that there's no commonality between these two experiences? And then I say, well, that doesn't strike me as being a plausible answer, because it seems to be the case that even if you change the object and even if you change the act type, it's still the case that there's a subject or a self that also has to be included, because that's what remains invariant when, in this very simple case where I'm just changing object and act type. So So to put it differently, if we forgot in our description of experience to include the self, or forgot to include the subject of experience, well then it seems as if there would indeed be, well, I mean, then we would be missing something important. And then some people might say, well, of course there has to be a subject of experience, but the subject of experience is not something that features in experience itself. It's rather preconditioned for experience, a bit like the eye. The eye is what enables me to see, but I don't see the eye itself. So the self or the subject of experience is a kind of transcendental precondition or metaphysical requirement, but it's not something that itself is experientially given. And then I am saying that I'm just trying to remember what am I saying. I'm saying that I'm then disputing that, and I'm saying that there is a way of what I'm saying is, well, if you think the self is a specific kind of object, or if you think the self is a specific type of qualia, well, then it seems very plausible to say that that kind of qualia or that kind of object is not always given whenever we are experiencing whatever. I mean, because then one could say, well, in some cases the self might turn up as an object if I'm introspecting, for instance. Perhaps there might be specific self-qualia that might come up in certain specific situations, but this is not the norm. This is not a universal feature of experience. So I think that's the wrong way to look for the experiential self. And I'm basically saying that what a more plausible way of looking for the experiential self is basically to identify it with the very subjectivity of experience. What is the subjectivity of experience? Well, that is the first personal givenness of experience. So the fact that, well, that experiences are not just objectively occurrent events, they are precisely always presented in a specific first personal manner. And that is also what makes my perception of a laptop and your very similar perception of a laptop very different, because one is first personally available to me, whereas your experience of the laptop is not first personally available to me. So I'm basically saying that one way to try to understand this very minimal notion of self is to relate it to this first personal dimension of experience. And I'm also saying that one way to understand it in more epistemic terms is to talk about in terms of the epistemic asymmetry that is present when I compare my access to my own experiences with my access to your experiences. And then I guess, and then of course there are all kinds of moves you can make then. Some will say that it might be true that there is something like that, but that does not yet amount to a self, because a self is something more robust. Or you might say that kind of first personal givenness might be present in some cases, but not in all. That for instance, if you are completely caught up in a certain situation, and if you're looking at a very exciting movie, well then your focus is entirely on the movie, and there's no first personal givenness of your experience. It's only when you cannot, start to reflect upon your experience that they become first personal, or it might be the case that that infants do not have first personal givenness, or that schizophrenic patients do not have first personal givenness. And so there's a lot of kind of discussions going on about whether this is a descriptive, valid statement, whether there might be exceptions, and so on and so forth.
Mm-hmm. Right. So I think you were exactly explaining the part that I was trying to, or we were having some questions. So this first personal givenness, for example, one could think that it could be understood as some kind of perspective or some kind of process where all these things come together, right? So if you think about Hume, then it's all those different bundles, right? So we could say, yeah, that's why we can make a difference. It's this bundle instead of that bundle, or if it's the process that brings all these together and not those together, right? So, but would you not want to describe it in that way, because you seem to want to say there is this first person, right? Because when I describe it in that way, the first person disappears, right? It is, or maybe not. I don't know. Yeah.
Well, I'm not sure I'm necessarily opposed to the idea of thinking of it as a process. It just depends on what one means by process, because I guess the reductionist who says that, well, it's about how all the different neurophysiological processes come together someplace in the head. Of course, that's not what I'm talking about. I mean, I'm not really addressing any neuro explanation at all. But it could be. I mean, what I kind of like about the idea of talking of it as a process is that I'm very opposed to the idea that the self should be something that somehow remains independent of the flow of experiences, because that is certainly not the view I'm defending. So it's very much one that is only present when there are experiences, and in that sense you could say that it's kind of processual. But I wouldn't take that to be an elimination of the self.
Sure.
And then of course, then you might say, okay, but does that make me into a human or not? And I guess my take there would be, and this is also something I discuss in the book. I mean, first of all, there are different takes on what exactly Hume's position was. And I've kind of been convinced by Galen Strawson's interpretation that actually Hume did not deny the existence of self. What he was saying was that you cannot encounter the self independently of experience. And that's a way of understanding that's very much aligned with my view. And so according to Strawson, Hume did not deny the existence of the self. What he denied was the persistence of the self, or the diachronic duration of the self. And so there might be a question then about, okay, what is the relationship between my minimal self, or there's a question about how enduring is it? And I have a chapter where I'm kind of struggling with that specific question and trying to situate myself between Strawson on the one hand and Dameson on the other. And basically coming down to, I'm not convinced. I find it phenomenologically implausible to argue the way Strawson argues that each and every experience has a new self, which to me makes it sound as if my relationship to my present experience and to my past experience is as radical as the relationship between my present experience and your present experience, which I just find a very kind of odd thing to say. So I am, I guess, more in favor of a more enduring type of self than Hume, and I'm kind of linking it up with Husserl's discussion of inner time consciousness. But I don't feel comfortable committing to the view that there is by necessity that a human life is by necessity underpinned by one and the same minimal self from start to finish. Because I don't know whether that is a claim that can be phenomenologically supported. And so the only thing I'm saying is that as long as there is first personal access to past experiences, I take that prima facie to indicate that it's the same minimal self that was there that is now, because otherwise I don't see how I could have first personal access. But there are of course experiences that I presumably had as infant that I have no longer access to, and to just say that, well, it still must be the same minimal self, I just feel uncomfortable saying that, but I don't really know.
Right. So, because that first personal access, for example, memory is a kind of first personal access, but then you could be accessing something that's actually not there, right? So
sure, but I also have a discussion of that.
Right. Yes.
Because there are different ways of understanding memory, false memory. And I think, I don't hardly remember the terms now, but there's this about, I think, false source memory. Where you I think a very famous case of that was Reagan, who once said that he had, fought in the Second World War, and it turned out that he had played a character who fought in the Second World War. So he was kind of, there was both something wrong and something right in his memory. He was wrong about the kind of source of that memory, but of course he was not wrong about he himself having previously had an experience. And I guess the question is, what kind of memory mistakes would be relevant to put challenge on my claim? And I guess what is important for me is just the claim that I had an experience in the past, and I can be completely mistaken about when it happened, what context it was. So I don't really know. I think that's something probably called total confabulation, where you're claiming you had experiences that you had just never ever had before. And they are strange indeed. I don't really know what to make of them, but.
It's just curious about psychopathologically, that actually you can see some person, they are in very serious condition, for example, dying person, brain damaged person, and how will you describe their sense of self? And also from some cases like schizophrenia or major depression, you can actually see their living experience. You may doubt they would have the sense of self. So and that actually links to my therapeutic training, like object relational theory. They talk a lot about self and other as well. And how do you think about? Would you give self this concept a kind of structure so that you can move on in some health conditions, that in some bad condition there's no self, but in some better condition you have self. And also in some certain condition the structure of self is fragile, and in some condition the self is some transcendental state.
When I was presenting at the East interview, I didn't explicitly mention that I was one of the co-authors on that work. So I have been collaborating with these psychiatrists for 20 years or so, and I think this minimal notion of self is actually very important in their attempt at conceptualizing what goes wrong or what is fragile in the case of schizophrenia. So the psychiatrists in question, they are basically primarily interested in schizophrenia, not in the other disorders. And so there is this ongoing debate about whether we in schizophrenia. So the claim would be schizophrenia is a self-disorder. And again, there are many of the classical philosophical psychiatrists who say the very same thing. It is a self-disorder. The question is then, well, it's a disorder on what level? And then the claim would be, well, this is not the kind of disorder where it's not the kind of self-disorder that you, for instance, find in Alzheimer's patients that have a problem kind of constructing a coherent narrative, who are unsure about their past, who might not know, what day it is, what their name is, where they are. It's not that kind of self-disorder. It's actually a self-disorder that, funny enough, might take the form of knowing exactly your own name, exactly the time of the clock and the physical location, but where the notion of who am I and what is now and what is here is mysterious or kind of, that's what evades their comprehension. It's not, again, it's not a, it's understanding what is a here, what does it mean to be at home in a here or in a now or or having a self. That's what is somehow fragile. And then there has been this ongoing debate, and I'm actually right now finishing a paper with two of my colleagues where we are going through a lot of cases of thought insertion, because thought insertion has often been taken as the paradigmatic case that should challenge the claim that experiences always have foreignness, because if a patient is complaining about the fact that foreign thoughts are invading his or her consciousness, well, that seems prima facie to be a case of me having an experience of me having a familiarity with certain experiences that are not given as mine, and that's why they are felt as strange. So is that a counterexample? And we are disputing that interpretation on our account. There is a certain dimension of self that is preserved, but there are, so to speak, certain of its features that are precisely more fragile, and which, for instance, doesn't allow any easy self-ascription. So I still think I think regardless of, so here's a way of putting it, regardless of how much, you might think of a patient who is saying, my thoughts are broadcast, they're public, everybody can see what I'm thinking. Now, of course, saying that, puts us in a slightly complicated situation, because on the one hand, we shouldn't dismiss what the patient is saying. On the other hand, we shouldn't necessarily take everything literal. And if the patient is saying that his or her thoughts are broadcast, meaning they are as public as the chair and the laptop, I would find that doubtful. I just don't think it's true. But of course, saying that, when he or she is saying that, it does of course somehow point to a certain very weird distortion of her first personal life. Because my claim would be, when she's saying that the thoughts are broadcast, when she's claiming that they are publicly available, I would say, but that's just not true. You still have a different access to whatever experiences you are undergoing than all the rest of us have. So there is a preserved first-person perspective, but obviously there also has to be something that is very odd, because otherwise you wouldn't describe your experience in these terms. And so we are trying to, provide a kind of model that will allow for a better understanding of what exactly is preserved and what exactly is being distorted. But again, I think so. My claim would be, and at least the psychiatrist I'm working with would say, none of the cases we have been presented with so far provides us with cases where there is experience, but absolutely no self any longer. There might be some patients complaining about blackouts, but blackouts doesn't provide the relevant counterexample, because blackout is precisely a case where you have no recollection of any experience. So perhaps there was a certain automaticity going on. It's just not clear that there really was an experience that just completely lacks first personal.
Do you differentiate the sense of agency and the sense of self?
Yes, so I think the standard way of doing it is to distinguish sense of agency and sense of ownership. That's one we have been using for a long time, and again, some people have said perhaps one shouldn't operate with it shouldn't be too much of a dichotomy. Perhaps certain forms of agency can influence, the kind of possession you take over what you are doing. So perhaps there is a certain forth and back between agency and ownership, but I think in principle it's kind of easy to spread it out. And the standard example is like this. If I'm raising my arm, and I apologize for this very trivial example, if I'm raising the arm, I have an experience of agency. I'm kind of the one who initiated the movement. I also have an experience of ownership. It's my arm that is moving. Now if you come over and raise my arm, I don't have a sense of agency because I did not initiate the movement, but it still felt as my movement, despite me being the one who raises the arm. And so I think the claim would then be that, there has been people who have also said, well, perhaps if we operate with agency ownership, might that help us understand what is going on in thought insertion? But I think that the idea that that it's just a lack of agency and a completely preserved ownership, which at some point was proposed, I don't think that is satisfactory.
Professor Xu has question.
I'll give you an example. Like you just mentioned that I don't know what do you mean I'm here, because if I want to know I'm here, I should know if I'm there. But when I say I don't know what is here or there, I mean I cannot figure out what does that mean to have the thing like space.
To have what, sorry?
Space.
Space, okay.
Okay. So because I cannot realize things like here and there, and it's very confusing. And so, what do you mean by here and the fate? I'm very much afraid of that. So I got a sense of agency. Because I'm just here. Here's the one feeling, the kind of feelness, and not knowing what's going on, and even here and there. Okay, but you see, when we say self is a kind of I install something within this spatial time reality. So I may lose or haven't had this kind of here, there sense. It's not just a language. It's a kind of experience, and I don't know what is. I even don't know what is the body, because the body is here. But still, I have that kind of, because I feel terrified. So I cannot even say I just feel terrified. Or terrifying happened here.
Sure.
So I still have the kind of sense of agency, but I don't have the kind of sense of self.
Okay, but that I don't. I mean, but that I don't understand that, because let's just say that you are overwhelmed by terror, so you're terrified. I mean, why should that involve agency? Why is that not passivity?
Because something says.
It seems that we don't have to use the word agency, and if we just use the word self, right? So, do you differentiate sense of self and self? So here, the self is, as you call it, is first personal givenness, or like you would say when you have consciousness experience, right? And then it seems that information become available to me in a special way that's not available to others. That's when I have consciousness experience, and that's why you want to call it minimum sense of minimum self, right? But which might be different from sense of self, which is I attribute that experience to myself, right?
It's just there are so many discussions.
Right.
Now you're kind of pointing to a different.
Sorry.
That's a different.
I know. Yeah.
Okay.
Integrate. I can give some real example. Because I'm psych nurse.
Sorry?
I'm psychiatric and mental health nurse.
Yes.
When we try to take care of the psychiatric patients, so like nursing, what is nursing? I think sometimes it's quite challenging. And I feel pitiful that I did not read through your book, but I think it's important. Like you face a patient with not normal self, and you have your own self. And at that time, just connect what you said about the shared emotion or the psychopathology. You can have a different minds to how to face your patient. Oh, he's kind of psych, he's a kind of a disorder, and then it might rock your emotion to identify this person. So I wonder how to cultivate, or how can we show our empathy in such a different situation. It's that two self counter. And also I feel interesting if you say shame. A lot of people have shame. I think it's a shameful people. They might be more rational. And also a lot of times, how to get into the we situation, because I think it's a shameful situation. Their self tend to be closed. And then do we need to try to open up or try to get into, or just respect her shameful situation, and how can we act ourselves to face another self?
Okay, so I think, I would think that the notion of empathy is very crucial for kind of dealing with the kind of challenges you were describing, and I think that's why I spent a lot of time in the book trying to explain that for the phenomenologists, empathy is not, and again, for anybody working in this area will know there are so many different definitions of empathy around. People can't agree on it. A lot of people would say empathy is about similarity. It's about me having the same experience as you. It's about perhaps about me projecting myself into you. And I don't think that has anything to do with the phenomenological understanding of empathy. I think for the phenomenologists, to put it a little bit kind of provocatively, empathy has more to do with preserving and respecting difference than imposing similarity. So it's precisely about recognizing, the alterity or otherness of the other and being open for that otherness, rather than automatically arriving with predetermined understandings of either, I have read in the textbook that if you're a patient of that and that kind, you behave in this and this way. That would be one way of trying to understand you. Another way would be to say, well, in the past, I had it in this way, so in all likelihood you have it in that way as well, so kind of projecting myself onto you. And I think the empathic, the way the phenomenologists talk about empathy is precisely neither one nor the other, but this kind of nurturing of a certain openness to the other and a certain respect also for the limits of how much I can come to understand of the other. There is actually, there's a colleague of mine in New York now called Matthew Radcliffe, who has talked specifically about empathy in a psychiatric context, and he has kind of written specifically on the topic I'm talking about now. So I would kind of suggest perhaps you try to check out his writings.
Now we come to the topics of shame, but I want to connect the minimal self.
Sure, but it's just, I have a little bit bad conscience because I didn't reply to your question, and let me just do it very quickly. So what is the difference between self and sense of self? And I think there are different divides you can make. So some would say, including some of the Buddhist scholars I have been discussing with, they would say, of course there is a sense of self. That's precisely the problem, because the sense of self does not match reality. So the fact that there is a sense of self doesn't tell us anything about there actually being a self. And what we need to do is to realize that these two things don't coincide. So that would be one way of talking about the sense of self. It seems as if there is a self, but that is a kind of separate thing from there actually being a self. So that's one way of talking about it. Another way would be to say, well, sense of self is actually something that only comes about in a kind of second step self-ascription. So when I'm just engaged in the world, or when I'm just having experiences, there is no sense of self. Sense of self is only again retroactively attributed by some kind of metacognition. And I would kind of disagree with both of those. So for me, sense of self is not merely about second order meta-ascription. It's a fundamental feature of experiential life per se. And I would also dispute the kind of move made by some of the Buddhist scholars to say, well, a sense of self is perfectly compatible with the non-existence of the self. Because I would make this kind of quick move and say, I'm interested in the experiential self, and if there is a sense of self, there's also an experiential self. whether there is some kind of other non-experiential self, I'm not interested in that. So I do think, and I guess the equivalent would be to say somebody who said, it seems to you as if you are conscious, but actually you aren't. I don't think that makes sense. And I kind of think, I think just as experience, the presence of experience is sufficient evidence for the existence of experience, I would say the sense of a self is sufficient for the existence of the kind of self I'm interested in. So I wouldn't allow for this, division between phenomenology and metaphysics, as some have suggested.
Right, and I think I get that point. Now, the reason why I brought this up is because going back to the paper that you said you were writing about, so there is this other example where supposedly a person feels something, and you can know that they're conscious of it, but they would attribute it to other people.
Sure.
Right, so would that be an example where there's conscious experience, but then there's something that problematic with their self, right, or sense of self, or right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, again, trying to determine exactly where the problem is kind of difficult. But I think that the again, so this is just I'm just repeating something I've said in the book and other places as well. I mean, let's not forget that the patients who are complaining about thought insertion, I mean, they are precisely complaining about it because they find it invasive. And I mean, that seems to presuppose that there has to be some notion of self or some notion of first-person perspective preserved, because they don't go around complaining about the experiences that belong to you, or experiences belong to anybody else. I mean, they complain about, so they don't complain about foreign experiences belonging to foreign minds. They complain about foreign experiences belonging in their own mind. I mean, so, and again, I mean, I can't even understand. I don't think we could understand that kind of situation if we really thought in these cases there's a complete elimination of any first-person perspective. I mean, I don't think we could even describe the psychopathological phenomenon.
I want to ask you some question about the self, then come to the shame, and then later come to the naturalization of phenomenology.
I just need to know, will you accomplish that during the last 5 minutes, or have you pushed?
Maybe we can.
I just need to know how long I'm going to keep going.
Maybe 6:15 or 20. Okay. You have mentioned the minimal self to baby or infant. You have special say animal. Animal is the personal self. So you have at first said different self, especially for me it's ecological self. And do you think ecological self is similar to this minimal self, ecological self?
Okay, so are you saying eco or ego? Eco with C.
We see. Ecological.
Yes.
Ecological.
Yes. So I'm very happy to adopt that way of talking, because of course if you go to Neisser, I mean, he would talk about the ecological self as something that was present basically from birth onwards, and had to do with the experience of being an organism interacting with an environment. So there was a very fundamental self, no self-distinction. So I'm kind of, I mean, I think that's very much in line with what I'm talking about.
Talk about the self, minimal. Okay. And you come to the topics of shame is connection between the minimal self and the negative self. Yeah? So it seems to me the minimal self is potentially social. Potentially. Now, through the topic of shame is disclosed. Then come to the negative self.
Yeah, well, except of course, I mean, shame was just supposed to exemplify a certain self-other conscious emotion. And so I wouldn't want to say that if you haven't felt shame, you will never be able to develop as a narrative self. I don't think that is plausible. The point I wanted to make was that shame might exemplify a situation where you come to experience yourself through the eyes of others, so to speak. And my point would be that this kind of externalized self-experience is, I think, very important for the development of a richer notion of self. But shame is just one example.
One example. Yeah. Then I come to Zahavi's about the relationship between phenomenology and the naturalism. I just talk the Zahavi's thesis. Yeah. So we can come another question raising, then come slowly to conclusion. And I think Zahavi is the make difference. 3 relationship between phenomenology and naturalism. The first one is direct naturalization of phenomenology. Yeah, you are against such. Yeah, it's a critique of Husserl's. It's also a critique on this side. The second is cooperation of phenomenology with natural science. Yeah? That means phenomenology provides a theoretical structure of natural science and clearing those concepts that scientific investigation needs. Yeah, the second. But the third relationship you just developed, maybe not so to end. That means the concept of nature that natural science supposes might be changed. Yeah, and so that phenomenology could cooperate with that. So we reconsider not only the concept of nature and also transcendentality. Yeah, what is the future? Yeah, this is the naturalization of phenomenology. Zahavi is special. Suggests somebody is for, somebody is against. Yeah, so.
But I guess I really can't say much about the third. So the idea is, that there might be, there might be different ways of understanding the relationship between natural science and phenomenology. There might be a certain kind of collaboration, but there might also be a kind of more profound, more radical way of reconceiving the very relationship between the natural and the transcendental. And I don't really have any. I don't have any suggestion. I'm just saying that, theoretically, that is an option. I do think some people are working on that. So again, I'm mentioning Evan Thompson in the book, who is trying to use phenomenology to kind of influence our understanding of biological processes and vice versa. And I'm just saying that, if you really are very ambitious about how to integrate, naturalism and phenomenology, this might be something worth exploring further. And again, this is not at all something I know enough about, but I know people who are also interested in, say, the relationship between quantum mechanics or relativity theory and phenomenology. That's just as a historical point. There's this strange thing that Hermann Weyl, who was a very influential mathematician and physicist, was very influential in developing quantum mechanics. He was an ardent admirer of Husserl's transcendental idealism, and so that somehow also influenced his way of thinking about space and time in a very fundamental way. Again, I'm not at all in a position to contribute to that project, but it's kind of an interesting, I think, idea to think perhaps there could be a certain crossover there as well. So,
yeah. Time limitation. We have not yet discussed about empathy, but maybe later. Okay, some question or Zahavi is very tired. 4 hours.
Yes.
Marathon.
You look pale.
Yes.
Yeah, so for us, we every day we deal with like an interesting example. I have one time interview a person with DID, dissociative identity disorder, multiple personality. Whenever this person say I don't know who is talking about. You know, then we come back and see the transcription and see, wow, what's that? How many people is there talking with us? So the other example about the self, you know, the I, the things, yeah.
Yeah, but again, I mean, just to refer to what we were earlier discussing, I mean, there's a difference between talking about self as a synchronic unity and as a diachronic unity. And I mean, my focus has primarily been on the synchronic one. So at any given time, experience is self-involving. And to point to cases where in a sequence of experiences, and of course it's all, I guess there's a lot of possibility for discussion about exactly the status of that syndrome, but to point to a case where over a sequence of time, different selves pop up, is not per se a fundamental argument against my position, because at any given time there will still be a self. It might not be the same self as previously.
But I was trying to see the process of coming to call here I.
Yes.
You know, even each personality, each the person or the agent saying I. There's a process. There's a essential process. You know, becoming or emergent and taking the word I to refer to here.
Sure.
So I think like that is, you know.
So I guess another way of putting it is also to say, the moment we start using the first person pronoun, the moment we start to self-ascribe identity, I mean, this is already a more complex process, and I mean, it might be that in order to account for that, I mean, again, the story has to be more complicated.
I think in this situation, I think it's quite challenging as a profession. Like we emphasize that we have to act or play the role as a therapeutic self. And sometimes the textbook teach a profession have to be cool. But sometimes you need to show your empathy. So I think it's quite challenging how, when you talk about the emotion, shared emotion, and how can be a good therapeutic or good way to practice your caring attitude or your therapeutic effect. I wonder what's your opinion?
Yeah, but I'm not sure really. I really think this is outside my area of competence. so I don't, because I think initially I think I would be. I would find it a very interesting idea that the emotional response of the caretaker is surely something important. So the idea that one should somehow keep a very neutral attitude strikes me as very strange. But I don't really have anything more to say, unfortunately.
How the mother showing empathy to a baby who, the mother is very accurate doing that, even we don't, we don't know if there's a self there, but we can do that kind of empathy. So what's that?
Yeah, but here's another example. Because think of the still face experiment. Where you present the baby, in front of caretaker, and there's a kind of proto-conversation, a kind of dialogue, and then suddenly, the mother goes kind of blank, doesn't respond in any way. It's extremely upsetting to the child, of course.
Actually, we cultivate the self up. I treat the baby as having a self.
Yeah, but it's just that, but I'm a little bit skeptical about it, because some people would say that's all there is to it. The reason why people have selves and the reason why they have experiences is because they are treated in that way by other people. And that's a kind of, I think, a very social constructivist take that I really don't think is in line with what phenomenology has to say. So I'm not disputing that how others respond to me can affect and influence and mature who I am, but there has to be something there.
Sure. We have some phenomena to talk about. Okay.
Yeah, should we close here?
Yes.
Huh?
Yes.
Okay, tomorrow in Tsinghua. It's about maybe
More. Zahavi.
Tomorrow was back.
Yomi and we, how to combine social cognition and social ontology.
Yes, very important.
Important, yeah, this is the final.
Yes.
Final in Taiwan.
So thank you all very much
thank you
for
your
participating.
participation.